Have you ever sat in a place so familiar, yet it felt like you were seeing it for the very first time? A quiet porch in early autumn, the kind where the air carries a faint edge of cool, but still holds the last traces of summer warmth. Somewhere in the distance, a crow calls once, and the sound seems to linger longer than it should. On this porch, there's an old wooden swing. Its chains creak softly with the slightest movement, and the seat is worn smooth from decades of unhurried mornings. The kind of mornings where time doesn't seem to move at all, where each breath feels deeper, slower, and somehow heavier with meaning. And yet, there's something about today that feels different. Maybe it's the way the sunlight falls in slanted golden lines across the boards. Maybe it's the memory of a voice you haven't heard in years, rising in the quiet like a gentle tide. Or maybe it's something else entirely, something waiting to be noticed if you'll stay here for a while. So settle into the swing beside me and let the morning unfold. The first cool breath of autumn had drifted into the valley overnight, settling over the fields and the quiet houses like a soft, invisible quilt. It was the sort of morning that did not rush to announce itself. The light came slowly, spilling from the horizon in long, patient strokes, filling the spaces between the maple leaves, finding its way into the thin mist that lay over the low pasture, and turning it a muted gold. Eli stepped onto the porch with the kind of careful slowness that belonged only to mornings like this. His boots made a low, hollow sound against the boards, and the air met him with a faint, dry chill that smelled of wood smoke and the far-off sweetness of ripe apples. Beyond the rail, the yard sloped gently down toward the split-rail fence, where the grass still clung to a few scattered drops of dew. They caught the light in a way that made them seem like tiny beads of glass, trembling but unbroken. The porch swing hung just where it always had, suspended from thick, blackened chains that had outlasted more than one generation of hands and feet. Its wooden slats were worn smooth in places, rough in others, each mark a quiet record of someone who had sat here before. There was the long, pale patch along the armrest where his grandfather's elbow had rested nearly every morning of Eli's boyhood, the shallow groove in the seat where his grandmother's heel would gently press while she rocked herself in the hours after supper. Eli lowered himself into the swing, letting it take his weight, and it answered with a slow, stretching creak. It was a sound that did not belong to any other place in his life. No apartment balcony, no city bench, only here, on this porch, in this light. He leaned back, resting both hands along the smooth top rail, and allowed his eyes to wander across the yard, past the last of the summer flowers bowing their heads in the cool air, toward the orchard that stood like a memory at the edge of the property. From here, the orchard was only a cluster of dark shapes in the morning mist, but Eli knew each tree by heart. He could trace their arrangement in his mind. The two old apple trees near the fence, the younger pear tree with its narrow branches, the cherry tree whose blossoms had once been the centerpiece of spring in this place. Years ago, he had helped his grandfather rake the fallen fruit into piles, their sweet and sour scent thick in the air, the skins warm under the autumn sun. Some were perfect enough to eat right there in the grass. Others went into baskets for pies or cider, while the bruised ones were left for the deer and the bees. The swing rocked slightly as a faint breeze curled around the porch, bringing with it a sound Eli had not heard in a long while, the faint, irregular clatter of the tin rooster atop the barn roof. It was an old weather vane, its paint worn down to bare metal, creaking softly as it turned in the wind. The barn itself stood at the far side of the yard, its wide doors still closed, a thin shadow of the roofline stretching over the packed dirt in front. Somewhere inside, he knew, there would still be the smell of hay, dust, and the faint trace of oil from his grandfather's tools. The morning felt unhurried in a way that was rare in his life now. There was no bus schedule to keep, no meetings waiting on the other end of a screen, no clamor of traffic building in the streets below his window, just the slow turning of the earth under the softest light and the gentle pull of the swing as it answered each of his movements. From the far side of the creek, a single crow called, a low, measured sound that carried easily in the stillness. The air seemed to hold on to the sound for a moment, letting it stretch across the pasture before it disappeared into the silence again. Eli's eyes followed the sound out toward the tree line, where the first orange edges of the maple leaves caught the morning light. He remembered how, as a boy, he had been told that the first leaves to change were like the first words of a long, slow conversation between summer and autumn. It was not an argument, not a sudden handover, but a steady, careful exchange, one season leaning into the next, until the change was complete. From the porch swing, you could watch that conversation unfold day by day, a single crimson branch appearing among the green, a carpet of gold growing under the sycamores, the sky deepening into a clearer blue as the air cooled. Eli shifted slightly, feeling the swing sway in its familiar arcs, and drew a long breath through his nose. The scent of damp earth reached him first, then the faint sweetness of fallen apples that must have rolled down into the grass by the fence. There was also something less distinct, something he could not quite name, a scent that lived only in this valley in this time of year, like the breath of the land itself. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sounds and scents weave themselves together. The quiet groan of the chains, the rustle of leaves in the distance, the steady rhythm of his own breathing. It was the kind of moment that did not need to be chased or held. It simply was, and that was enough. Somewhere in the kitchen behind him, a kettle began its low hum on the stove. The sound filtered through the open window, mingling with the morning air. Soon there would be the smell of tea, his grandmother's old blend of black leaves and dried mint from the garden. He could almost taste it already, the warmth filling his hands as he wrapped them around the mug, the steam curling into the cool air above the porch. But for now, he stayed where he was, letting the swing carry him in its slow, small arc, forward and back, forward and back. The boards beneath his boots creaked softly with the motion. Out in the pasture, the mist began to lift, revealing the faint outline of the old wooden gate at the far end of the fence. He thought of how many times that gate had swung open for friends and neighbors, for deliveries of firewood, for children running in with news or mischief on their faces. The day ahead would unfold as it wished, with or without his attention. Here, on the swing, the pace was set not by clocks or lists, but by the simple weight of the air, the angle of the light, the rise and fall of the breeze. And as the morning settled in around him, Eli felt that quiet truth sink into his bones. Some places hold you not because you are needed there, but because you belong there. The kettle's hum rose as if the house itself were clearing its throat to greet the day. Eli listened without moving, letting the sound join the small orchestra of morning. The faint creak of the swing, a thread of wind in the maple, the softest clink where one length of chain touched another. He stayed just long enough to memorize the exact angle of light falling across the porch boards, the precise place where warmth met shadow, then stood and let the swing drift to stillness behind him. Inside, the kitchen wore its age without self-consciousness. The floorboards had long ago learned to sing their separate notes when stepped upon, and the old enamel stove, white once and now a gentle cream, held to its place as faithfully as a tree keeps its hill. Eli reached for the kettle with the towel, steam curling up in little ropes, and poured the water over a spoonful of black tea and a pinch of the dried mint his grandmother had tied in twine and hung years before. A small sweetness drifted up, not the thick sweetness of syrup, but the thin, clean kind that comes from herbs and heat and time. He stood with his hands around the mug while the tea steeped, letting the warmth work its way into his palms, and thought of his grandmother's way with mornings. She never hurried through them, even on days when a dozen tasks waited in neat rows beyond the door, laundry to shake out on the line, jars to sterilize, a pail of milk to set for skimming. She would sit with both feet on the bottom rung of the chair, wrap her fingers around her cup, and let the first 5 minutes belong to the day and to herself. No one had taught her that manner. It had grown in her, the way moss grows on a north fence. On the windowsill, a line of small jars held the last of summer, thin coins of peaches caught in honeyed light, tomatoes cut and laid to dry, a cluster of dill seeds that had come loose and fallen from their heads, now gathered and saved. Eli lifted one jar and turned it in his hand, watching the light slide through the glass. On the lid was his grandmother's handwriting, looping and steady, Mint, '09. He smiled at the way time lived in the house, not as a calendar, but as an arrangement of objects with quiet memories attached. When the tea had deepened to the color of old penny copper, he fished out the leaves with a fork and set the mug on a saucer. A second mug waited on the shelf, its handle smoothed by years of use, blue rim a little chipped. He took it down too, filled it with hot water and poured it out again so it would be warm if he wanted more. The small attention to comfort pleased him, this careful making of a soft place inside an ordinary hour. He carried the tea back to the porch as if the steam were something alive. Outside, the day had moved a shade brighter, though it still held to its gentleness. The air lay lightly on his skin, cool and precise, and the swing accepted him as though it had expected his return. He took a slow sip. The mint rose first, green, clean, a memory of a better rain. Then the tea followed with its depth and weight. He could have put sugar as his grandmother did, but decided against it. Some mornings were better honest. Down by the fence a spider had built overnight, and now the web held a careful geometry of water, each droplet caught like a tiny lantern. Eli set his cup on the porch rail and watched as the spider, small and exact, tested each thread with one front leg, then another, listening with its body. A breeze lifted and the whole construction moved as one thing, not 100, and then settled again. He thought of the work hidden in such a web, the gathering, the measuring, the choosing of applause, and found himself grateful for a craft that asked nothing of him except that he look. Somewhere along the road, a truck shifted gears gently, considerate of morning. A blue jay placed and replaced itself on a branch, rehearsing a call it did not yet send. The world seemed to be taking its time to wake, and Eli was glad to have the leisure to wake with it. His eyes drifted to the barn. It had been painted red last when his grandfather still climbed ladders without argument. Even now, the color held in the protected places beneath the eaves, while the south wall had worn to a thoughtful rose, and in patches to the soft brown of the boards themselves. He remembered the scent inside, the layered smell of hay, old rope, the iron singing of tools, and felt a quiet tug to go and visit it, as one visits a neighbor. He finished his tea in small sips, listening for the bottom of the cup, and set the empty mug on the step to cool. The boards gave their small complaint under his weight as he rose. He paused to lay a hand along the top rail of the swing. There was a particular spot, polished by his grandfather's palm, that fit Eli's hand the way a river stone fits the hollow it has made. The grass along the path held its dew stubbornly. He walked slowly, not to keep his boots dry. There is no keeping the morning off your feet, but to keep from scaring the day away. Each step pressed a darker green into the lawn that would lift again when the sun climbed and pulled the moisture free. He traced with his eyes the line the dog used to walk, nose to ground, back when there had been a dog. It pleased him that the grass still remembered. The barn door complained at first, as old wood does, then yielded. Inside, the light fell in straight bars through the small windows, and the dust in those bars looked almost like the inside of a clock, particles rising and falling, measuring out the hour with no hurry. The workbench stood as he had left it, a tin of nails, a hammer with a handle smoothed to 100 grips, a coffee can holding a handful of screws, a pencil stub worn to the ferrule. He drew a breath and felt the place speak to a part of him that had gone quiet in the city, the part that knows how to fix a hinge, how to listen to a tool, how to discover the next right task by simply standing in the room and paying attention. In the corner, a coil of rope waited like a sleeping snake. Beside it, an oil can wore a dull sheen of dust. He took the can in his hand, and in the act of wiping its mouth with an old rag, he remembered a summer afternoon at 12, his grandfather pressing the can into his palm and saying, "Not too much and not too little. Listen to what the chain tells you." It was not a lesson about oil only. He carried the can back to the porch, not out of obligation, but because it seemed a kind thing to do, the way you straighten a picture frame in an empty room. The swing accepted the attention with a modest murmur. He touched the tip of the can to a link, then another, and the oil found its way along the iron's small articulations. When he set the can aside and settled back on the seat, the chain spoke in a lower voice, a contented one, though not silent. Nothing in a house should be perfectly quiet. Sounds are how you hear that life continues. He sat again and watched the steam fade from his cup. The spider had moved to the shaded corner of its web, holding itself as still as a thought not yet spoken. A pair of finches landed on the fence in their light way, little commas in the long sentence of the morning. He could feel a slow warmth in his chest, something not unlike the tea, gathering. It was not happiness exactly. It asked for less from him than that word often did. It was more like a recognition, a homecoming measured not in miles or days, but in the small accuracy of ordinary things. Beyond the yard, the creek kept itself hidden just now, but he could hear its presence in the constant mind of the place, the quiet insistence of water going about its business. Later, perhaps, he would walk down past the sycamores and look for the slow eddies that gathered leaves, the water striders writing their elegant, temporary script on the surface. For now, the porch held him like a hand under his shoulder blades. On the small table by the door lay a stack of index cards bound with a rubber band gone brittle. He brought them onto his lap and unwrapped their bundle with care. Recipes, most of them, apple butter, low and slow, cornbread, no fuss, pickles, leave a little room to breathe, and then a few that were not recipes at all, a list of birds seen one spring, each checked off in a neat square, the name of a neighbor written in big letters, call about the fence but ask after his mother first. He smiled at the way kindness had turned up on a practical card, as if there were no category for it, but things to do. He slid the cards back together, pulled the rubber band around them twice, and set them where they were before. To live in a place rightly, he thought, is not to fall upon it with plans, but to ask gently what it needs, and then to keep your promises. The sun, finding its way along the porch floor, touched the toe of his boot and made a small warmth there. He stretched his legs a little and let the swing find a slower rhythm still. The morning had moved along without urgency, and the valley honored it by staying soft. Somewhere a door shut, the sound rounded by distance, and a dog barked once as if to confirm the fact of things. He thought of the days ahead, not by their tasks, but by their shapes. There would be afternoons that asked him to mend, to prune, to clear. There would be evenings that asked only for a chair, a book, maybe the radio faint in the next room. There would be rain, and in the rain the roof would speak, and in that speaking there would be a sense of being answered. He felt no need to arrange any of it just now. The porch was lesson enough. Sit, see, listen, and the world will meet you in the way it knows how. A puff of wind turned a leaf on the maple so that its pale underside showed for a moment, like the belly of a small fish in shallow water. Then the leaf righted itself, and the tree resumed the quiet conversation it had been having with the sky. Eli watched the exchange and found his breathing sink to it, slower now, easier. He let his eyes half close, then open again, more like a door standing ajar than a gate swung wide. Somewhere in the cotton fields of his memory, a line of his grandfather's voice rose. We don't rush a thing that already knows how to grow. He could hear the gravel of age in it, the kindness that made even a rebuke feel like shelter. He let the sentence stand in the air between him and the yard, then let it settle like dust in sunlight, present and untroubling. In time, he rose to refill his cup and did so without hurry, as if the kitchen were a place a man could go to learn the value of small steps. The second infusion of mint lifted into the air like a reminder that the day was still generous with its small gifts. When he returned, he did not pick up the cards again, nor the oil can, nor his thoughts particularly. He sat, he drank, he looked, and as the light moved another inch, the swing carried him through a few more arcs of the kind of motion that convinces a body it is safe. He felt in that safety the kind of weariness that is not a failure, but a simple accounting. The long labor of city days still held in his shoulders, the knotted worries that had learned to sleep inside his breath. He noticed them without calling them by name. He let the morning make a place for them, and in being held so lightly, they began to loosen. Not all at once, not in any dramatic way. Just as a fence post set deep in the earth will move a quarter inch over a decade without anyone seeing it happen. The swing eased, the cup warmed his hands, and the valley, having offered itself, asked nothing more. Here, in the safe company of ordinary things, Eli found the beginning of a rest that was not the absence of thought, but the presence of peace. He leaned his head back, watched a slice of sky through moving leaves, and let the day keep him. He would rise later. He would walk down to the orchard and see what had fallen. He would set a few apples on the porch rail and choose one to eat, crisp and clean, and the juice would carry the memory of summers he had already lived and those he had yet to know. For now, he let the present be sufficient, and the swing answered, forward and back, steady as breath. The morning had passed into that gentle hour between breakfast and the day's first true labor, an in-between time, when the light has climbed high enough to set the dew trembling off the grass, yet still carries the soft edges of early hours. Eli sat on the swing again, a fresh cup of tea in his hands, the second steeping from the same leaves, lighter in color now, but still fragrant with mint. He held the cup close enough to feel the faint warmth against his face, breathing in slowly until the steam disappeared into the cool air. Beyond the porch, the orchard was beginning to show itself more clearly as the mist thinned. The shapes of the trees resolved into their familiar selves, each one distinct, like neighbors you've known since childhood. Some leaned a little to the left, bent by years of wind from the same direction. Others stood straight, branches reaching evenly toward the four quarters of the sky. Their leaves were shifting toward autumn, a green still present but tinted at the edges with the first yellow, the first soft rust of change. Eli remembered when those trees were younger. He had been younger too, of course, but it was the trees he thought of now. How they had seemed fragile at first, their trunks thin as broom handles, their branches small enough to bow under the weight of a single bird. His grandfather had tied some of them to stakes, steadying them through the first winters, watching over them with the same care he gave to the calves in the barn. It had been a slow kind of tending, the kind that teaches you patience because the reward is not immediate, but measured in seasons, in decades. A single apple caught his eye, bright against the darker leaves, still hanging though the others around it had already fallen. It swayed gently in the breeze, as if testing its own readiness to drop. Somewhere inside that fruit was the memory of spring blossom, of bees moving from flower to flower, of rain soaking into the roots and sun warming the bark. The apple was not just a moment, he thought, but a long series of moments gathered together, made whole. The swing creaked softly as Eli shifted, resting the cup on his knee. A blue heron lifted from the creek bank, its wide wings carrying it in a slow, deliberate line across the pasture. It did not hurry. There was no sense that it was fleeing anything, only that it had another place to be in its own time. He followed its path until it disappeared behind the sycamores, leaving only the echo of its movement in the air. Somewhere behind the barn, a faint clatter of metal reached his ears, a loose sheet of tin or a tool shifting where it had been left. The sound was brief, then gone, as though the day had decided it was too early for noise. Even the crows, usually insistent in their calls, seemed inclined to rest their voices, leaving the morning to the softer chorus of sparrows and the occasional tapping of a woodpecker at work on some unseen trunk. Eli's thoughts moved, without urgency, circling back to summers when the orchard was full of his cousins. They would come in July, their parents trailing behind with baskets and jars, and the porch swing would hold them two at a time, their bare feet pushing off against the rail to send them higher than they should. The air had been thick then with the scent of cut grass and sun-warmed fruit, and the evenings rang with the sound of laughter spilling out past the screen door. Now, the swing moved at a gentler pace, carrying only his weight, but it seemed to him that it remembered all those other mornings too, and rocked him in that memory. He lifted the cup again, taking a slow sip. The tea was cooler now, but no less welcome. In the quiet, he could hear the faint ticking of the chains, metal settling against metal as the swing moved. The sound was steady, a small metronome marking the unhurried rhythm of the day. Looking down toward the fence line, Eli noticed a patch of goldenrod just beginning to bloom. It was always the last wildflower to appear before frost, a final bright note in the meadow's song. His grandmother used to cut a few stems for the table, saying they brought luck to the house. He thought he might do the same later, though for now he was content just to watch them sway gently in the light wind. The porch boards under his boots were warm now from the sun. He stretched his legs out, letting the tips of his boots catch the light, and felt a quiet satisfaction in the simple act of being still. It occurred to him that this was the kind of stillness you could not find by seeking it. It had to be allowed, invited, and then met halfway when it arrived. A squirrel appeared at the edge of the yard, pausing with one paw lifted, head turning slightly as if to take measure of the morning. It darted forward, stopped again, and finally disappeared into the grass near the base of the orchard. The small disturbance it made in the leaves seemed almost deliberate, as if reminding Eli that even in stillness, life goes on around you. From inside the house came the faint sound of the clock in the hallway, a deep, slow chime marking the hour. The sound was not loud enough to command attention, but it settled into the air like a familiar voice, one you had known long enough not to startle at its arrival. Eli thought of how that clock had stood in the same place for as long as he could remember, its pendulum swinging behind the glass, keeping time not just for the house but for the lives lived within it. He let his gaze wander back to the orchard, where sunlight now dappled the grass between the trees. The shadows moved with the wind, forming and reforming shapes that would never exist in exactly the same way again. He felt the truth of that, and with it came a quiet gratitude for being here to see them just this once. A thought passed through his mind, unhurried and unforced, that perhaps the work of living was less about doing and more about noticing. The porch swing, the goldenrod, the heron's flight, none of these asked anything from him but his attention, and in giving it, he felt more whole than in any task completed. The tea was nearly gone, a shallow warmth at the bottom of the cup. He set it aside and leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. The swing moved with him, its arc small and steady, and he imagined that if he stayed here long enough, the day would unfold around him like a slow-turning page, each moment written in light and wind and the faint music of ordinary things. Somewhere, a memory rose of his grandfather's voice telling him one quiet afternoon that the land has its own way of speaking to those who will listen. Eli opened his eyes, and in the play of sunlight through the leaves, he thought he understood. By late morning, the light had thinned into that clear steadiness the valley kept for its fair days. It lay evenly over the pasture and across the boards of the porch, neither demanding nor showy, simply present the way a good neighbor is present, close enough to be known, far enough not to crowd. Eli's cup had cooled to the last swallow, and the swing's arc had settled nearly to stillness. He held the cup a moment longer as if it were a small ember from the house's heart, then set it on the rail and stood. He did not set out with a plan. He let his feet tell him where to go, the way a creek finds a low place and follows it, down the steps, across the soft lawn where the dew had at last surrendered, and toward the orchard, He walked with the slow attention that lets a man keep company with his own breath. The grass brushed his cuffs. A cricket made a small correction to its position as he passed, unhurried, and went back to its instrument. At the first apple tree he stopped, not for anything particular, only because stopping felt right. A handful of apples lay in the dapple beneath the branches, some perfect, some bruised in the honest way, fruit bruises when gravity does its ancient work. He stooped and picked one up. The skin held the cool of shade, and a faint bloom dusted its red. He turned it in his hand, brushed the leaflet with his thumb, and brought it to his mouth. The bite was quiet and decisive. The flesh broke with a wet whisper and gave up its clear sweetness. He chewed slowly, and the taste called forth the memory of a certain September market, where his grandmother compared apples with the authority of a weathered hymnal, declaring this variety truth-tellers and that one show-offs, then laughing at herself for the sermon in it. He ate half and saved the rest, setting it on the fence rail to finish later. A yellow leaf, thin as a child's ear, rotated down past his shoulder and came to rest on the toe of his boot. He watched it a moment longer than necessary, the way a person watches a sleeping infant, not out of concern, but out of affection for the miracle of its quietness. Beyond the orchard, the ground sloped to the creek. A path, once tramped daily and now softened by seasons, offered itself. Eli followed, brushing his hand along the tall stems of goldenrod, their tassels trembling and releasing the faintest dust of sunlight. A grasshopper sprang from the green and landed again 2 feet ahead, as if to show him how to proceed gently and still arrive. The creek welcomed him with its own language: run, hush, glint, keep. Water curled around a stone and threw a moving net of light across the gravel bed. On the far bank, the sycamores kept their pale, mottled bark in their large, quiet hands of leaves. A kingfisher scolded softly from downstream, then thought better of making a fuss and held its peace. Eli sat on a flat rock where his grandfather had once sharpened a knife, and the old groove in the stone made a cradle for his palm. He had thought, for a time in the city years, that rest was something you wrestled down and trapped. Here, rest seemed like a shy animal, one that would come close if you did small things carefully and did not stare when it drew near. He kept his eyes on the water and his ears on the nearby sounds, the drop of an acorn, the small ripping of a minnow as it changed direction, the distant baritone of a cow speaking to another pasture. He let himself be taught, again, that nothing needed a conclusion to be complete. A narrow board, gray with age, bridged a shallower section where in spring the water could be quick and mischievous. It had been his childhood test: step across with a pail of water and do not spill, or else start again and learn where your feet belong. He did not cross it now. He only nodded to it as one nods to an old rule that shaped a steadier posture in a young back. When he rose to return, he took the longer way around the sycamores, following a bend that brought him along the fence line. The gate there hung a little low. He tested the hinges with a finger and felt the complaint. Not loud, but persistent, the way a joint will talk to you when it wants small kindness. He lifted the gate an inch and set the latch more squarely. A short length of twine, knotted and forgotten on the post, offered itself. He looped it once, twice, and the gate held true. A repair of 10 seconds and no glory, but the sort of mercy a place remembers. At the barn, he paused again. A swallow drew a clean line above the door and entered the dark, the way a hand enters a pocket. Inside, the air had gathered the sun and scents. Hay baked sweet, old leather made patient the agreeable temper of wood. He did not linger to take up a task. He let the barn keep its peace and walked back toward the house, where the porch waited with the natural patience of a thing made for waiting. On the steps sat a shallow basket he hadn't noticed earlier, the woven willow bleached by years of summers. He took it in, appreciating how the handle fit his palm, and placed it by the swing where it could be useful later for apples or for the small necessities of some other day. The cup on the rail had cooled completely. He poured the last sip into the garden bed below, where a tired clump of mint received it without ceremony. Inside the kitchen, the clock gave its 2 beats at the half hour, then resumed its quiet pendulum. Eli stood in the doorway and looked over the humble congregation of familiar things, the enamel basin, the wooden spoon with its worn oval mouth, the check towel hung to dry. On the table, the check oilcloth held a scatter of old buttons, some matched to their mates by color, some orphaned but not discarded. He ran a finger through them and felt the small history of shirts and dresses, of cuffs that had survived long enough to be mended twice and still be worth mending. From the drawer, he drew out a thin notebook with a cracked spine. Names and dates filled the first pages, planting, rain, frost, then gave way to recipes in his grandmother's hand, and, here and there, a sentence that was not recipe or record at all. Mrs. Cartwright's boy returned with his sleeve torn. He is all right. Remember to ask her if she needs anything. He smiled, not at the torn sleeve or the worry, but at the tender bookkeeping of a life that counted more than pounds of flour. He set the notebook down and left it open so the room might read it too. When he returned to the porch, the swing received him as if nothing had happened in the world. He sat and let his bones take again the counsel of the slow arc. The day had warmed, but a shade held under the eaves, and with it a kind of inwardness that suited the hour. Across the road, a figure on a bicycle moved through the light at an easy pace, and the small bell chimed once as if to wish the valley well. He thought, not of what he had done, but of what had been done to him by the simple practice of being here, how the orchard had spoken in the apple's language, and how the creek had instructed him without a word, and how a gate had taught him that attention is a form of love. He felt the city in him quiet, its habits of rush, its appetite for noise, quiet not from scolding, but from being outnumbered by better customs. A small wind came from the west, drawing shadows longer along the floor. With it came a hint of smoke from some distant brush pile, a smell clean as ironed cotton. He pulled the old quilt from the wicker chest by the door and laid it across his knees. It was the kind of quilt made over years, when cloth is too dear for waste and memories are too dear to be left without handwork. Triangles and squares from shirts retired and a summer dress worn thin at the waist. A bit of curtain hem, a darker patch at one corner that once had been a pocket. He ran his fingers over the seams. He could tell where a younger hand had learned by the way the stitches began too long and ended right-sized. He could tell where a tired hand had finished a patch late in the evening, the thread running a little crooked as the hour leaned toward bed. He let the quilt warm his lap, and with it felt the company of those who had given their hours so that others might be comforted. In the close hush under the eaves, he thought of writing a letter, not the quick kind he had written in recent years, bent over a glowing screen, but the slower kind that asks a man to stand up and fetch paper and sit again and hold a pen, and in the holding, to consider more carefully what belongs in the mouth of his page. He pictured the first words, "I have come home to a porch that remembers me," and smiled at how much of a boast it would have sounded in his city life, where home was something rented and the porch belonged to someone else, and swifts built nests in other eaves. He did not fetch paper now. He let the letter live inside the quiet, where good sentences often begin. The swing creaked again, less a complaint than a confession, that it too was made of parts that needed tending and had received it. He breathed with it, the way one breathes with a sleeping child on one's chest, careful not to shift too quickly, and yet not so careful as to forget the ease that makes sleep possible. The valley's sounds rearranged themselves by degrees. A tractor puttered somewhere beyond the ridge, respectful of distance. The dog across the road barked twice and then, as if satisfied, performed the unremarked miracle of falling silent. A bee investigated the porch post, found nothing it wanted, and wrote a small circle of the air before heading for the goldenrod. For a time he closed his eyes, not to shut anything out, but to welcome what could be heard only when sight rested. He listened through the layers, wind speaking leaf, leaf brushing leaf, chain taking weight, releasing weight, a high, almost brittle chatter that must be a wren in the lilac, the deeper, continuous speech of the creek telling its old story to any rock that would listen. Behind these, the human distance, hum that says there are lives being lived within a few miles. The world did not ask him to sleep, but offered sleep as a companionable option. He took instead the middle road of that pre-sleep calm, where the mind moves slower than a cloud shadow. When he opened his eyes again, the light had shifted a hand's breadth along the rail. The half-eaten apple where he had left it had drawn a wasp. It stood, delicate and industrious, bending its narrow waist, harvesting in the small economy of its kind. Eli watched without alarm. The wasp paid him no mind and left a minute later its flight sure, carrying sweetness to a place he was not invited and did not need to go. He thought, as afternoon edged nearer, of something his grandmother used to say when a day unfolded itself in quiet usefulness. We did enough to know we were here. He considered his small errands, the bite of apple, the path to the creek, the twine at the gate, and found in them that old arithmetic of contentment. He did not need to prove anything further to the day or to himself. His hand fell to the smooth place on the swing's arm, and he let it rest there. The wood, warmed by the hour, seemed almost to breathe under his palm. He let the warmth pass into him and pass through. Without resolving to do so, he allowed his shoulders to loosen, his jaw to unclench, and his breath to deepen just enough to feel it touch the lower ribs and return. If someone had asked him what he was doing, he might have said, truthfully, nothing. But he knew better now than to think that nothing was empty. The porch and the orchard and the creek and the barn, and he himself were all engaged in the old work of belonging, seeing and being seen, holding and being held, mending what had asked for mending and leaving the rest to time. A bit of cloud, no more. Then a sheet laid thin across the blue drew itself over the sun and let the temperature fall a whisper. He drew the quilt up and felt his eyes soften again. Somewhere inside that ease, an hour waited for him to live it at the pace of leaves falling. One, then a space, then another, an hour that did not require keeping, only receiving. He let it come, and the swing, faithful and forgiving, carried him forward and back, the porch a safe harbor, the day an open hand and the valley breathing with him as if it had all the time in the world. By the time midday began its quiet work of drawing the shadows short, the air had grown a little warmer, though it still carried the edge of autumn's first breath. The porch was lit full now, every board laid open to the sun's hand, and even the chains of the swing gleamed in places where the oil had darkened them. Eli shifted slightly, letting his feet rest on the cool patch still hiding in the shelter of the rail. The quilt lay folded across the arm of the swing, patient and ready, like a friend who waits without asking when they'll be needed again. Somewhere in the pasture, a cow lowed once, the sound rolling over the grass in that round, hollow way that belongs only to animals speaking across open space. It was answered faintly from farther up the slope. The exchange felt timeless, older than his own years here, older even than the orchard, as if the pasture itself kept a conversation going from season to season, year to year, and the cattle merely lent their voices to it for a while. He reached for the apple he'd left earlier on the rail. The skin was a touch warmer now, and the spot where the wasp had visited showed a small, neat arc of missing flesh. Eli bit into the other side, the crunch giving way to sweetness that filled his mouth in slow, dissolving waves. It tasted not only of fruit, but of the tree's patient work, months of gathering sunlight through every green leaf, drawing water from soil that had been here long before his grandfather ever planted a fence post. After a while, he set the cord gently at the base of the steps for whatever small creature might find it, and leaned back into the swing. The wood was warm against his shoulders. He let his eyes wander out across the road, where the gravel shimmered faintly and the ditch grass leaned toward the light. It was the sort of view that would have gone unnoticed in his city life, too plain, too unchanged, but here it seemed like a kind of blessing, steady without need for ornament. From inside, the smell of something faintly sweet began to slip through the open windows. It was not strong enough yet to name, only a soft suggestion that the kitchen had begun to turn its thoughts toward the afternoon. It might be the last of the peach preserves simmering on the stove, or a pan of cornbread just set into the oven. Whatever it was, Eli felt a slow anticipation stir in him, not the impatient kind, but the kind that trusts the right moment will arrive on its own. A gust of wind rose from the west, running a hand through the maple leaves overhead, and a few let go without ceremony. One landed on his knee. Its edges were already curling. The veins darkened into a map of themselves. He turned it between his fingers, noting the way its color shifted from green at the stem to a dry, sun-burnished gold at the tip. In its small way, the leaf held the same story as the orchard's apple, the long gathering, the slow letting go. He thought, as he often did here, of how the world's lessons came without a syllabus. No one had to stand at a blackboard to teach him that all things move toward rest, or that the letting go of one season is the making of another. The porch itself was a teacher, the swing a book whose pages were turned by the wind. A pair of sparrows landed on the fence post. They hopped once, twice, then stilled, their heads turning in quick, deliberate angles. The light caught in the fine feathers along their backs, and Eli thought of the hours of unseen work those small bodies carried out. Flights over the field, the patient building of a nest from grass stems and twigs, the steady work of finding seed enough to live by. It humbled him to think that the same air they lived in was the air he breathed now, that the same sun warmed them both. He rose at last, drawn by the smell from the kitchen, and stepped inside. The cornbread was cooling on the counter, its surface split in a soft golden crust. Beside it, a jar of the season's last honey sat open, the light glinting off the slow movement inside. Eli cut himself a square, still warm enough to steam when broken, and drizzled the honey in a thin amber line. He ate standing at the counter, each bite grounding him more firmly in the present, each swallow a quiet gratitude for simple work well done, by the bees, by the grain, by the unseen hands that had tended it all. When he'd finished, he rinsed his plate and set it in the rack, then stepped back to the porch with a clean mug of cool water. The air met him again like a familiar handshake. In the orchard, the shadows had begun to lengthen just slightly, though the sun was still a good climb from the horizon. The breeze had shifted, carrying with it the sharper scent of dry grass and something faintly resinous, perhaps from the pine grove beyond the ridge. He settled once more into the swing, letting its slow arc find him again. The chain gave its contented murmur. The boards beneath him, warmed all morning, seemed to release their stored heat into the cooler air, as if reluctant to let go of what they'd gathered. Across the road, the figure on the bicycle passed again, this time coasting downhill, the spokes catching the light in brief flashes. The small bell did not ring this time, but Eli imagined the sound anyway, as if the valley itself had carried it forward from earlier. His thoughts moved the way the clouds moved, loosely, without hurry, reshaping themselves without losing their quiet. He thought of mending the screen door before the weather turned, of splitting kindling for the first fire of the season, of writing down the apple butter recipe in his own hand before another year passed. None of these needed doing now. They would come when they came, and the porch would witness each of them in its time. The water in his mug caught the light, holding a small rippling image of the sky above. He tilted it slightly, watching the reflection shift and scatter. It was such a small thing, yet it felt as complete as any painting he'd ever stood before in a gallery. Perhaps more so because it was his alone in this moment. He drank, set the mug down, and let his hands rest, open, on his knees. The swing carried him forward and back, the air soft against his face. Somewhere in the orchard, a branch released its fruit. He heard the muted thud as it met the ground, followed by silence, as if the earth were keeping the gift for itself for just a little while before offering it up to be found. And in that silence, Eli felt something loosen, not a knot undone all at once, but a thread given a little slack. It was enough. The day was enough. And he stayed there, eyes half closed in the safe company of porch and orchard and sky, breathing in the peace that asked for nothing more than to be received. Through the early afternoon, the valley kept its vow of quiet, a kind of gentle agreement between sky and field that nothing need assert itself more than necessary. The sun had settled into its steady climb, and the light on the porch had lost its first brightness, becoming something softer, rounder, like a voice lowered for the sake of the room. Eli let the swing find him again, the boards creaking in their old companionable way. He rested his palms on his thighs and felt the slight weight of the day where it had collected in his shoulders, then breathed until the weight became more like a memory than a burden. A slow air moved through, bringing with it the faint resin of pine and a sweetness he could not quite name. Perhaps the last of the clover, perhaps a jar of jam opened in some neighboring kitchen. Down past the orchard, the creek spoke in its constant grammar of small currents, turning the stones into listeners. A hawk rode a thermal above the far fence, untroubled, letting the valley do the lifting. He watched it drift and felt a modest envy, the good kind, the kind that wants not to possess but to understand. He had not meant to sleep, but a drowse came over him the way evening comes, by degrees, without insistence. His eyelids lowered until the world became a softened copy of itself, colors gentled, edges rounded. He did not wholly surrender. He stayed in that middle place where the mind loosens its grip but does not let go, where time stretches thin enough to see through. The chain murmured its even syllables, forward and back, forward and back. His breath joined it, and somewhere in that measured duet, the city unknotted another length inside him and lay quiet. When he opened his eyes again, the light had moved a hand's width along the rail. A hush followed the return, like stepping back into a sanctuary after lighting a candle. He reached for the mug he'd left warming in the kitchen, now refilled with water drawn cold from the tap. The glass sweated against his palm, a small constellation of droplets forming and running their short courses to the rim. He took careful sips and felt the uncomplicated gift of it, clean, cool, sufficient. A small errand presented itself, not a duty but a kindness he could offer to the house. So he rose and fetched the screen door from its hinges. The mesh had torn near the latch, a 2-finger width where summer flies found their welcome too easy. He brought the door to the porch steps and set it across his knees. From the kitchen drawer he'd taken a length of new screen, a stapler that still remembered his grandfather's hand, and a pocket knife whose blade had been spoken to with whetstone care. He worked slowly, not from clumsiness, but from respect, pulling the old mesh free, smoothing the new square over the frame, setting the staples in a rhythm that sounded like rain beginning, one and then another and another, each small bite of metal a promise to the house. Where the corners needed tucking, he paused to measure with his thumb, then made the neat fold that would please a person who understood such things. When the knife trimmed the excess mesh away, the scrap fell into his lap like gray lace. He turned it once in his fingers before setting it aside, honoring even what would be thrown away. Back on its hinges, the door accepted the latch with a quiet click that felt like an answer. He swung it open and closed twice, then let it be. The porch approved in its silence. He sat again, not to admire the work, but to enjoy the small ease it had added to the day, as if the house had exhaled. From the road came the sound of tires and gravel, careful, unhurried. A neighbor in a pickup passed by, lifted 2 fingers from the steering wheel in that old country greeting that means, "I see you, I wish you well." Eli answered with a nod. He felt the exchange land between them like a coin laid on a windowsill. No debt incurred, only acknowledgement, a small bright thing catching light. He brought the wicker basket onto his lap and thought about the orchard. Apples still hung where the sun had not hurried them, and the ground would have gathered what the branches had relinquished. But the porch held him, and he chose not to go yet, trusting that the trees could keep their bounty for another hour. He let his eyes travel instead over the near distances, the porch post with its nicks from long ago summers, the hairline crack in the top rail like a river sketched on a map, the single nail head turned to a darker circle under the years of weather. These were the sorts of details the city had taught him to ignore for the sake of speed. Here, speed had no arguments left to make. A honeybee arrived without ceremony and tested the pail of his folded quilt, then lifted, dissatisfied, and drew a lazy figure 8 in the air, before drifting toward the goldenrod by the fence. The sight of it called to mind the small box hives that once lined the edge of the pasture, his grandfather's quiet partnership with the bees. He remembered how the man had moved among them in his white shirt sleeves, hat brim low, bare hands slow and sure, how smoke from a smoldering bundle of sumac clippings had drifted like a sacrament. "Don't panic them," his grandfather had said, voice like a fence post set right. "If you're steady, they will be steady." He tasted honey then, the memory of it on the afternoon air. Sun in a jar, summer kept for winter. His gaze fell to the basket and he stood at last in no rush, turning toward the orchard. He set one foot in front of the other as if the ground were a page and his steps a patient script. The grass gave under him without complaint. Where the path dipped, he tipped the basket's mouth toward his hip and let his hand skim the tops of the stems, counting the season's textures, the soft tassel of foxtail, the straw brittle stalk of Queen Anne's lace, the stiff brush of seed heads not yet spent. At the first tree he chose not to pick, but to gather what the earth offered freely. Apples rested in the shade, some newly fallen, their skin still unmarked, some bearing the simple story of gravity and ground. He lifted them one by one, set each into the basket so that none bruised the other, a kindness remembered from many harvests. A breeze wandered through and set the leaves whispering above him. He paused and listened to the language. It spoke of simple things, wait, light, release, and he took its counsel to heart. He did not fill the basket to its rim. Enough, he thought, and left what remained for deer and wasps and the small republic of ants who worked with such relentless democracy. On the way back, the sun leaned almost imperceptibly toward afternoon. A speckled dog appeared at the far end of the lane, investigated a patch of weed with grave purpose, regarded Eli from a respectable distance and moved on. The encounter registered as reassurance. The world was doing its work. You had only to take your place in it. He washed the apples at the sink with a bowl of cool water, the skins shining as they rose and turned under his hands. On the counter, he set a cutting board, a paring knife, a small bowl for peels. He did not intend a recipe grander than slices on a plate, the truth of apples speaking for itself. Still, he saved the peels, coiling them into the bowl in long red ribbons, because waste had always seemed to the house a kind of rudeness. He carried the slices out to the porch on a plain plate, set them within easy reach, and took a bite that tasted of the orchard's patience. A cloud, the thin kind, drew itself across the sun and made a temporary gentling of the yard. The temperature changed no more than a thought. He drew his heel along the porch floor, feeling the grain lift under the sole of his boot, then placed his foot flat and was still. Across the road, the cicadas found their note, held it, let it fall, found it again. The sound did not argue with the quiet, it deepened it, like shading deepens a drawing. He thought of writing as he had earlier, and this time fetched paper from the desk by the hall, a sheaf of envelopes left from years when letters were an every week thing, not a nostalgia. He brought a pencil too, one with teeth marks near the eraser, proof of earlier thinking. Back on the swing he began not with deer, but with the day's real beginning. This morning the light moved across the porch and taught me to breathe. He paused not to search for a better line, but to let the true one arrive if it wanted. The pencil waited on the paper like a boat held lightly at the dock. He wrote a few more sentences, plain ones about the screen door mended and the apples gathered in the hawk's unlabored circle. He did not aim for poetry. He aimed for accuracy of heart. When he finished the page, he did not sign it. He left it there to dry and for the Porch to read, if Porches read. He folded them, quilt up from the arm, and laid it across his knees again, a companionable weight. From somewhere along the ridge came the first suggestion of evening, just a cooler angle of wind, as if the day had drawn a breath to consider what came next. He blinked slow. The swing answered forward and back, not with the insistence of a metronome, but with the patience of a tide that has known its shoreline always. In that room of quiet, a memory stood up and crossed to him without fanfare. A Sunday afternoon when he was small, his grandmother teaching him how to thread a needle. "Don't lick it," she had said, warm and practical. "The thread swells. Flatten it on your tongue, then try." He had done as told, astonished at the way such a fine thread found its way through a hole so impossibly small. "Most work goes like that," she'd said, the needle bright in her hand. "Small patience, and the path makes room." He felt the sentence settle into him now, as if it had been spoken only this minute. The road gave one more sound. A distant door of a distant truck closed gently, twice, a practice of care that travels. He took another apple slice, ate half, and placed the rest on the rail, for the wren should it want a taste of sweetness. The creek kept its counsel. A single leaf broke free from the maple and began what looked like a long consideration, drifting down in a measured zigzag that did not need a witness, but found one anyway. The light slid another inch. He did not chase it. He let it go where light goes, into the long angle of the later hours. The day had not rushed him, and he would not rush the day toward its end. In the house, the clock gave a muffled quarter chime, as if clearing its voice softly in a church. He thought again of the city, not with judgment, but with the same fondness a person feels for a younger self who tried hard at the wrong things. There had been a time when he measured days by what he had done to them. Lists crossed off, calls made, tasks performed. Here he felt the measure was kinder, what the day had done to him, how it had gentled the bones, how it had made room for breath, how it had added a small seam of mending where a rip had begun. He closed his eyes one more time, letting the sounds of the place arrive without knocking, the percussive tap of a far woodpecker, the chafe of grass against grass, the breath of the swing in its chain. His breath matched the swing again, and the valley's steady presence wrapped him in its simple robe. No lesson pressed, no revelation strained the quiet, only the long, humane patience of an early autumn afternoon, and a man who had chosen, finally, not to make any moment larger than it wished to be. He kept that promise for a while. No clock consulted, no future summoned, only the apple's clean taste lingering, the quilt's weight, the script of light drawing itself across the rail and onto his hand, and the swing, reliable as forgiveness, carried him forward and back, forward and back, until the world and his breath in the small furnace of his chest spoke all in the same low key. The afternoon had settled into the kind of stillness that was not absence of sound, but a rearranging of it, quiet layered with the fine threads of small noises that carried no demand, the kind of stillness that made a person's thoughts slow their gait, finding they could take the longer way without consequence. The air felt rounder now, as if the sun had softened its edge in preparation for its gradual departure toward the horizon. Eli sat with the quilt still folded across his lap, his hands resting lightly upon it. The swing moved only when he willed it, and even then, only slightly, a gentle forward and back that matched the slow rhythm of his breathing. He had the sense, not for the first time, that the swing carried not just his weight, but a portion of his thinking too, easing it the way a good horse will take some of the rider's strain without acknowledgement. The apples he'd gathered earlier lay in the wicker basket beside him, their skins mottled in the way that spoke of honesty more than perfection. The air around them was faintly sweet, and every so often the breeze would bring that sweetness up to him as if offering it again. He thought of leaving the basket there until evening, letting the day breathe around them a little longer before taking them inside. Food, he had come to realize, was not just for eating, it was for holding, for noticing, for remembering all the hands and seasons that had brought it to this moment. From the fence line, a shadow moved, slow, deliberate. A neighbor's old hound had wandered up the road and now ambled along the edge of the yard. Its gait was unhurried, the kind of walk that belonged to animals who had lived long enough to understand there was nothing worth chasing. Eli watched it pause to consider a patch of grass, then lift its head in a vague, friendly acknowledgement before continuing toward the far end of the lane. The moment left behind a small, companionable warmth, the sort of exchange that required no words and left no debt. The light had changed again. It was subtle, the shift from the direct, clear shine of midday to the gentler, sideways light of afternoon. The shadows grew longer, leaning toward the east, and the color of the boards underfoot deepened into a warmer tone. In the orchard, the leaves caught the light differently now, the edges almost translucent where the sun pressed through them. He thought, briefly, of the work that would come with the colder weeks, gathering in the last of the garden's offering, stacking firewood under the shed roof, checking the windows for any draft that might ask to be sealed. These were not worries. They were simply the next conversations he would have with the house and the land. It struck him how much gentler such conversations were here compared to the hurried negotiations of his city life. There, the seasons had often felt like deadlines. Here, they were more like letters, arriving in their own time, meant to be read. Slowly, the sound of the creek reached him in the stillness, less insistent now, a softer conversation with its stones. It reminded him of afternoons when he was a boy, sitting on its bank with the stick, tracing the water's current without any plan or reason. His grandfather would sometimes join him, saying little, perhaps tossing a pebble in now and then just to watch the rings spread. It occurred to Eli that some of the best teaching he had ever received came in those silences, in the steady companionship of someone content to share space without filling it. A bird, he thought perhaps a thrush, began a quiet song from somewhere in the hedgerow. It was not the full-throated announcement of spring, but a softer, more conversational music, as though it were speaking to the late afternoon itself. He listened until the pauses grew longer, then faded into the general fabric of sound the day was weaving. Inside the kitchen, the clock gave its low chime for the hour. He could picture the slow swing of its pendulum without needing to see it. That pendulum had been keeping the measure of days here longer than he'd been alive, and its sound felt as much a part of the place as the grain of the porch boards or the tilt of the barn roof. The swing shifted under him as he leaned back, eyes half closing. In that narrow space between waking and sleep, memory drifted up without being summoned. He saw himself at 12, returning from the orchard with a bucket of windfall apples, his grandmother waiting by the kitchen door with a paring knife in hand. The smell of cinnamon had been in the air, and the windows had steamed slightly from the pot on the stove. She had looked at him then in that way she had, half proud, half amused, fully present, and he'd felt in that moment the kind of belonging that required nothing in return. The thought faded into the present as the wind shifted, carrying the scent of distant wood smoke. Someone, somewhere in the valley, had begun the season's first small fire. It was a smell that belonged to evenings, to the quiet stretch of time when the day had done its speaking, and the night was still deciding what to say. Eli reached for an apple from the basket, turning it in his hands before biting into it. The skin gave way with a crisp sound, the flesh cool against his teeth. He chewed slowly, letting the sweetness fill his mouth before swallowing. The taste seemed to gather the whole day into itself, the morning's cool mist, the midday's easy warmth, the orchard's patient labor. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a tractor started up, its engine a slow, even hum. It moved at the pace of someone who knew the value of fuel and daylight, both, unhurried but steady. The sound rose and fell with the lay of the land until it was absorbed again by the folds of the valley. The quilt shifted slightly on his knees as he leaned forward to set the apple core on the rail. It rolled once, then came to rest against the wood. Thought of leaving it there for the evening, letting the night creatures decide its fate. The swing's chains gave their small rhythmic voice again as he pushed off gently with his heel. Forward and back, forward and back. The world beyond the porch seemed to keep time with it. The slow drifting of a cloud across the sun, the steady arc of a leaf falling from the maple, the gradual lengthening of the shadow from the porch post. Eli let the rhythm carry him deeper into the quiet. The quilt's weight was a reassurance against his legs. The air was cool enough to touch the edges of his cheeks, and somewhere in the orchard, another apple dropped to the ground with a sound as soft as a sigh. He thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of grace. As the sun eased lower, the light took on the richer tones that belonged only to this part of the day. The fields beyond the fence seemed to glow from within. The grasses turned to gold. The far tree line deepened into a quiet blue. It was a view he knew well, yet each time it felt like a gift arriving fresh. The thought came to him, as it sometimes did, that the day would end without ceremony, and that was its own perfection. There would be no sudden flourish, only the slow turning toward evening, the small changes in light and sound that marked the passage. He felt himself ready to meet it, here on the swing, with the basket of apples at his side and the quiet work of the valley continuing all around him. The wind eased again, and in that stillness, the porch felt like the safest place in the world. He let his eyes close fully, the swing rocking him in its steady embrace, the kind of movement that reminded him of being carried, not away from anything, but deeper into the heart of where he was meant to be. And there he stayed, breathing with the rhythm of the place as the day leaned gently toward its rest. The sun had begun its slow descent, and the afternoon air carried with it the first cool hint of evening. It was not yet a true chill, more the promise of one, a whisper that the warmth of the day would soon loosen its hold. The light had shifted into the softer range, spreading in wide, amber strokes across the porch boards and laying long shadows that moved with the trees. The swing creaked faintly beneath Eli, its rhythm slow enough to feel almost like stillness. The basket of apples sat where it had been all afternoon, each fruit catching the light in its own way, some dull with the powdery bloom of the orchard still upon them, others shining from where his hands had turned them earlier. The scent was subtle, not so much a fragrance as a presence in the air, blending with the wood smoke he had caught on the breeze before. It made him think of kitchen tables covered in clean cloths, of knives set neatly on cutting boards, of the first slice into a crisp apple and the sound it made, a sound as much a part of autumn as the rustle of leaves. From somewhere in the orchard, a pair of crows broke the quiet, their voices carrying across the slope. They were not alarmed, only conversational, exchanging calls in a way that seemed to measure the distance between them. Eli listened until their voices faded, absorbed by the larger hush that had begun to settle over the land. A single dry leaf skittered across the porch floor, caught by a small wandering current of wind. It spun once before coming to rest against the leg of the wicker basket. He bent to pick it up, turning it between his fingers. Its veins were pronounced, the stem brittle. It had given all it could to the season and now lay light as a sigh in his palm. He set it gently on the rail, where it might catch the last light before evening took it. Inside the house, the clock in the hallway chimed softly, one measured note for each of the hours past noon. The sound was rounded by the distance, yet clear enough to mark the time. It struck him how the hours here did not feel like something to be used up, as they had in the city, but more like something to be inhabited. They held their shape no matter what he did with them, and they passed without hurry, like the creek making its way around the bend. The breeze shifted, bringing with it the resinous scent of pine from beyond the ridge. It mingled with the faint, earthy undertone of fallen leaves beginning to break down in the damp hollows of the yard. Somewhere a door closed softly, the sound carried just far enough to be known, and then set back down in the quiet. Eli drew the quilt higher over his knees. Its weight was familiar now, like the weight of a hand resting in reassurance. He thought about how many evenings it must have covered his grandparents before him, on this porch, in this same light, while they watched the day turn itself over into night. The thought carried with it a feeling of being part of something that had begun before him and would continue after him unbroken. He reached for one of the apples and took a slow bite. The skin cracked softly, the flesh cool and sweet. The taste carried with it the long labor of the orchard, the slow swell of blossoms into fruit, the patient holding of each apple until the moment came to let it fall. He chewed with care, as though the apple deserved nothing less. A thin line of cloud moved across the sun, and the light shifted again, losing its golden edge and deepening into something quieter, more introspective. The yard seemed to pause with it. Even the sparrows, usually busy in the hedge, had settled into stillness. It was the hour when the world seemed to draw a longer breath, preparing itself for the closing of the day. He leaned back into the swing, letting his gaze rest on the orchard. The trees stood patient and unassuming, their work for the season nearly done. In their posture he saw a kind of wisdom, an acceptance of the cycle that asked for nothing more than the right kind of attention and care. It was the same wisdom the porch seemed to know, the same that the creek carried in its steady voice. From far down the road came the low hum of a tractor. It moved slowly, the sound rising and falling with the lay of the land until it faded into nothing. The absence it left behind felt like a gift, as though the valley had reclaimed its own quiet. He glanced at the apple core in his hand, now reduced to its simple frame of seeds and stem. Rather than toss it aside, he set it gently at the base of the porch steps, a small offering to whatever creature might find it in the night. The light was sliding further now, leaving the porch half in shadow. The quilt felt warmer against his legs, the air cooler against his face. He could hear the faint rustle of leaves high in the maple, the sound carrying a hint of the season to come. It was not a warning, only a reminder, spoken in a language too old to be hurried. He thought of lighting the lamp inside, of setting the kettle on for tea, but there was still enough light to sit a while longer, enough warmth to make the quilt's comfort something chosen rather than needed. So he stayed, watching as the sky began its slow work of turning toward evening, and in that staying, he felt again the truth he had been learning since his return, that life did not always need to be filled, that sometimes the most faithful thing you could do was to be present for the small, passing moments that asked nothing of you but your attention. The swing moved with him, forward and back, steady as a heartbeat, and the day, content to end in its own time, held him there until the first shadow of night began to brush against the edge of the porch. By the time the sun had lowered itself toward the tree line, the colors of the day had begun their slow transformation. The blue of the sky softened into a pale wash, and at the edges, where the light touched the horizon, a faint gold began to pool, deepening with every minute. The orchard was half in shadow now, its trees standing like quiet sentinels, their branches darkened against the light behind them. On the porch, the air had grown cooler, enough to make Eli draw the quilt closer around his legs. The swing moved beneath him with the same unhurried rhythm it had kept all day. Forward and back, small arcs that seemed to keep time not with any clock, but with the turning of the earth itself. The sound of the chains was softer now, as if they, too, were settling into the hush of the evening. In the basket at his side, the apples lay untouched since he had returned from the orchard, their sweet, faint aroma blending with the first threads of night air. From somewhere beyond the barn came the soft lowing of a cow, answered after a moment by another from farther off. It was a familiar exchange, one he had heard so many times over the years that it had become part of the texture of evening in this place. The calls were not urgent, only a simple accounting between them, a way of noting presence before the night began. Eli's eyes followed the slow drift of a cloud over the ridge. It caught the last light and held it, glowing softly before dissolving into the deeper blue above. The sight carried him back to evenings in his boyhood, when he would lie in the grass and watch the clouds change shape until they faded into darkness. Sometimes his grandfather would sit nearby, sharpening a knife or mending a harness, saying nothing unless Eli asked a question. It was in those silences, he realized now, that he had learned most of what he still carried, that not all time needed to be filled, that listening could be more generous than speaking. A pair of geese passed overhead, their wings beating in slow, strong strokes. They called to one another as they flew, the sound carrying far across the fields. Their formation shifted slightly, one bird easing back, another moving forward. Eli watched them until they were only specks against the dimming sky, then gone entirely. The echo of their passage lingered in the air, like the fading scent of something just baked. On the porch rail, the leaf he had set there earlier was still resting, though the wind had shifted twice since then. Its edges curled slightly more now, and its color had deepened in the cooling air. It seemed to him like a small emblem of the day itself, still here, but leaning gently toward its end. The light from the kitchen window began to show faintly on the porch floor. Inside, the clock would be approaching its next chime, though he had lost track of the hour. It hardly mattered. Here, the measure of time was less about numbers and more about the changing tones of light. A light, The cooling of the air, the way the sounds of the valley shifted from the activity of day to the restfulness of night. From the orchard came the muted sound of an apple falling. It landed softly on the grass, rolling once before coming to rest. That sound, a sound he had heard countless times, held in it the whole story of the season, the patience of growth, the weight of ripening, the quiet surrender to gravity. He thought of the creatures who would find it before morning, the deer perhaps, or the possum that sometimes visited the yard. It felt right to leave it for them, just as others had left fruit for him in years past. The breeze brought a trace of wood smoke again, stronger now, as if someone nearby had added another log to the fire. It mingled with the scent of dry leaves and the faint, lingering sweetness of the apples. The combination was so deeply familiar that it seemed to settle into his bones, grounding him more firmly in the moment. He shifted slightly, tucking the quilt under his knees, and let his gaze drift to the farthest part of the yard where the grass gave way to the fence line. Beyond it, the field stretched out toward the ridge, the last light spilling across them in long, uneven bands. Here and there, a patch of goldenrod caught the sun, glowing against the darker grasses. He thought of his grandmother in these hours, how she would begin to hum as she worked in the kitchen, her voice blending with the sounds of the evening. Sometimes she would step out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, and stand beside him for a moment, both of them looking out at the same view. Neither of them needed to say anything. The silence between them was full enough. The chain of the swing gave a small, deeper groan as he leaned back, the sound resonating like the last word in a conversation before both speakers fall quiet. He let the motion slow until it was almost imperceptible, then sat still, watching the light fade from the upper branches of the maple. The sky was turning now, the gold giving way to rose, the rose deepening toward violet. The first star appeared, just one point of light, small but steady. It would be joined soon by others, but for now it hung there alone, marking the threshold between day and night. Eli felt the familiar pull of evening routines, the thought of lighting the lamp, of setting water to boil for tea, but he stayed where he was, unwilling to step away from these last minutes of daylight. The air around him felt like a held breath, as though the whole valley was waiting together for the day to tip fully into night. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a dog barked once, sharp and clear, then was silent. The sound carried for a moment and was gone, leaving the quiet deeper than before. He drew the quilt up to his chest and rested his head against the back of the swing. Forward and back, forward and back. The motion was slow, steady, reassuring. His eyes lingered on the line of the orchard, the silhouettes of the trees now distinct against the fading light. He thought of how they would stand there through the night, the same as they always had, rooted in their place, keeping company with the stars until the next sunrise. The evening was almost upon him, but it asked nothing of him except to be present for it, and so he stayed, the swing carrying him in its gentle arc, the air cool on his face, the sounds of the day slipping away one by one until only the quiet remained. The day's light had thinned into its final hour, that fragile stretch when the world seems to speak in a lower voice. It was not yet night, but the colors had begun their slow retreat, the gold fading toward amber, the amber to rose, the rose deepening into the first hints of blue shadow. Eli sat a while longer on the porch swing, watching the last slants of sunlight move across the yard until they caught the fence post and slipped away. The quilt was warm against his legs now, holding the heat it had gathered through the afternoon. He ran his fingers along one of its seams, feeling where the fabric dipped slightly under the stitch. It reminded him of his grandmother's hands, how they would pause over her work for a moment, pressing a seam flat before carrying the needle forward again. Her sewing had always seemed unhurried, as though she trusted that each stitch would find its way in time. That same patience lived here still, in the porch, in the orchard, in the quiet curve of the swing's motion. From the orchard came the sound of another apple letting go, landing softly in the grass. Eli could not see it in the dim light, but he imagined the way it must lie there now, round and whole, its skin breathing in the cool evening air. Perhaps a deer would find it before morning. Perhaps it would rest until the frost came. The thought brought a small satisfaction, knowing that the fruit had reached its own quiet conclusion without interference. The breeze carried with it a faint change, the crisp edge that belonged only to night. It slid under the porch roof and brushed against his face, not cold enough to startle, but clear enough to say that the day was finished with its warmth. Somewhere down the road, a screen door closed with a gentle thud. A single dog barked once, then settled, as if remembering that there was nothing urgent to report. Eli rose slowly, his knees giving the soft protest that comes from a day well spent, and gathered the wicker basket of apples. The boards underfoot gave their small, familiar creaks as he stepped toward the door. The kitchen light met him first, a warm, honeyed glow that spilled just far enough onto the porch to catch the rim of the basket and the hem of the quilt over his arm. Crossing the threshold felt like stepping from one kind of safety into another. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of what the day had held. Apples, wood smoke, a trace of cinnamon from a jar opened earlier in the week. The enamel stove, quiet now, still radiated the warmth from when he had boiled water that morning. On the table, the plate with the last apple slices sat where he had left it, a faint shimmer on the surface where the juice had dried. He set the basket down beside it and began to place the apples in a shallow wooden bowl, one by one, listening to the soft sound they made against each other. When the bowl was full, he left the rest in the basket, knowing they would be used in their time. It was an old rhythm, one his grandparents had kept before him. Bring in enough for today and let tomorrow bring what it will. No sense in rushing the work of eating any more than the work of growing. He filled the kettle and set it on the stove, the faint metallic ring of it against the burner marking the start of the evening's next quiet ritual. From the cupboard, he took down a jar of loose tea leaves, the lid clicking gently as it opened. The scent rose immediately, earthy, steady, touched with the faintest echo of mint. He spooned the leaves into the pot, listening to the hiss as the first threads of steam began to rise from the kettle. While he waited, he leaned against the counter, the warmth of the stove at his side, and let his gaze rest on the window above the sink. Outside, the light had faded further. The maple was now a silhouette, its branches drawn in clean lines against the dim sky. The first stars had appeared, 2, then 3, sharp and steady in their places. It occurred to him that the trees must know the stars well, having stood under them every night of their lives. The thought brought him a kind of quiet comfort, as though he too was returning to something familiar. The kettle's whistle rose slowly, without hurry, like a voice calling from a distance. He lifted it from the heat, poured the water over the leaves, and watched the steam curl upward, carrying the scent into the room. It was the kind of scent that filled the space without taking it over, settling instead into the corners, into the folds of the curtains, into the quiet itself. He carried the pot and a single cup back to the porch, placing them on the small table beside the swing. The night had come fully now, though the horizon still held a faint, lingering light, enough to see the shape of the orchard in the pale glint of the fence rails. Somewhere in the grass, a cricket began its even song, joined by another a few yards away. The sound was steady, without hurry, as though it intended to keep its measure all night. Pouring the tea, Eli felt the warmth rise into his hands through the cup. He took a slow sip, letting it rest on his tongue before swallowing. The taste was deep, familiar, touched with the faint sweetness of memory. Each sip seemed to settle something in him, smoothing the edges left over from other days, other years. The swing welcomed him back into its slow arc, forward and back, forward and back. He could feel the day loosening its grip, the hours unspooling behind him. The quilt lay over his legs once more, and the cup was warm in his hands. Out in the orchard, the night wind moved gently through the branches, and the sound of it was like a conversation spoken in a language he did not need to translate. The stars multiplied above, filling the spaces where the light had gone, and there, in the safe, steady rhythm of the porch and the swing, Eli let the evening carry him, content to follow its lead until it delivered him quietly to rest. The night had settled in with the quiet certainty of something that had been coming all day. The horizon's last thread of color had dissolved into a deep, steady blue, the kind that seems to have no end. Above the ridge, the stars had multiplied, patient and unblinking, as though they had been waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. Eli sat on the swing, the cup of tea now empty on the table beside him, the quilt a familiar weight across his knees. The chains of the swing whispered with each slow motion, forward, back, keeping their own time with the cricket's even song. It was the kind of sound that didn't intrude on the silence but deepened it, as if the world were humming under its breath. From the orchard, the wind moved in small, deliberate sighs through the branches. Every now and then, an apple loosened its hold and fell, striking the grass with a muted thud that was somehow both distant and near. Each fall felt like a small punctuation in the sentence of the night, marking time in its own quiet way. Eli's gaze drifted toward the far end of the yard, where the fence disappeared into the shadow of the maple trees. He could just make out the pale shape of the gate, slightly ajar as it had been since afternoon. It reminded him of how his grandfather had always insisted on leaving it open in the evenings. "Let the night come and go as it pleases," he used to say. It was a habit that had never been questioned, the kind of tradition that felt less like a rule and more like an understanding between the house and the land. A memory stirred then of sitting on the same swing as a boy, his legs too short to reach the floor, the quilt pooled around him. The air had been cool in the same way it was tonight, carrying that early edge of autumn. Beside him, his grandmother had cradled a cup in both hands, steam curling from it into the night air. She had told him stories, not loud or hurried ones, but the kind that began slowly and seemed to unfold like the evening itself. They were not always about people. Sometimes they were about places, about seasons, about the way the creek sounded in the spring or the smell of the barn on a rainy afternoon. Those stories had never been written down, but they had stayed with him in pieces, like small smooth stones in a pocket. Sometimes, without meaning to, he found himself turning them over in his mind, remembering not only the words but the spaces between them, the pauses where they had both simply listened to the night. The stars above him now seemed sharper than they had an hour ago. One in particular caught his eye, a bright, steady point just above the ridge. He remembered his father pointing it out to him years ago, telling him its name in a voice that had sounded almost reverent. It struck him then how certain lights could bridge decades in an instant, carrying the presence of those long gone back into the moment as if they had only stepped away for a while. From the barn came a soft rustling, likely the cat making her rounds. She appeared a few minutes later, a shadow slipping across the porch steps before leaping lightly to the railing. Eli reached out, letting his fingers rest in her path, and she pressed her head against them in greeting before settling near his feet. Her presence was as unassuming as the night itself, yet it carried a comfort he could not name. The lamp inside the kitchen window burned steadily, casting its gentle glow onto the porch floor. The light caught the steam from the teapot when the breeze shifted, making it shimmer for a moment before disappearing again. It was a small reminder that warmth was close at hand, that the door was never far if he needed it. He thought about going in, about letting the night carry on without him, but there was something in the air, some quiet invitation that kept him there a little longer. The swing's motion, the weight of the quilt, the familiar sounds of the land. It was as though the porch itself was holding him in place, asking nothing more of him than to be still. Another memory surfaced, unhurried and clear, the time he had stayed up with his grandfather to watch a meteor shower. They had sat out here with 2 extra quilts, sipping cocoa that had long since gone lukewarm. The meteors had come in sudden, brief streaks, each one drawing a soft exclamation from his grandfather. At one point, they had both fallen silent, not from weariness, but from the realization that the night didn't need their commentary. The sky had its own voice, and it spoke most clearly when they simply listened. Eli leaned back now, tilting his head until his view was filled with that same sky. No meteors tonight, just the slow, steady turning of the stars in their courses. It was enough, more than enough. Somewhere in the valley, a barred owl called, a low, rhythmic sound that carried across the fields. It was answered almost immediately by another, farther away. Their exchange felt ancient, as though it had been happening every autumn night for as long as the hills had stood. He imagined generations of owls calling to each other under the same constellations, long before anyone had ever built a porch here. The cat shifted slightly, curling her tail around her paws, and Eli reached down to stroke her once more. Her purr began as a faint vibration, growing steadier, folding itself into the sound of the swing in the wind in the orchard. The night had deepened enough that the ridge was now a single dark shape against the star-filled sky. The air carried a bit more chill, but the quilt and the tea's lingering warmth held it at bay. He knew he would go inside soon, but not just yet. The world outside felt too balanced, too perfectly in step with his own slow breathing. And so he stayed, rocking gently, listening, letting the night work its quiet way into his bones, until the boundaries between memory and present moment blurred, and everything he had ever loved about this place seemed to gather around him in the dark. The decision to go inside came as quietly as the night itself. Eli shifted slightly on the swing, letting its arc slow to stillness. The cat, sensing the change, rose and stretched, before stepping lightly down from the porch railing to vanish once more into the dark. He took one last look across the yard, where the orchard lay under a thin veil of starlight, every tree outlined in the faintest silver. The boards beneath his feet murmured with familiar creaks as he stood, gathering the quilt into the crook of his arm. The teapot was light now, only a trace of warmth left in its belly, but he carried it with him like an old friend walking beside him. When he reached the door, his hand rested for a moment on the worn brass handle, feeling the coolness of the metal, the faint give where years of turning had polished it smooth. Inside, the kitchen welcomed him with its soft lamplight. The glow pooled gently on the wooden table, touching the bowl of apples, the chipped ceramic sugar jar, the folded dishcloth waiting by the sink. He set the quilt over the back of a chair and placed the teapot near the stove, letting the quiet of the room settle around him. There was no hurry to do anything more. For a while, he simply stood by the counter, looking at the shelves that lined the wall. There were jars of preserves, plum, blackberry, and apple butter, each one labeled in his own hand, the dates written carefully in the same faded blue ink. Some of those jars had been made on mornings bright with summer sun, others on afternoons heavy with rain. He could remember the sound of fruit sliding into the pot, the scent rising as sugar melted into it, and the slow, steady stir of the wooden spoon. He thought about making a small plate, bread, a little butter, maybe a spoonful of the apple preserves, but decided to wait. The thought of it was enough for now, and there was a kind of quiet satisfaction in knowing it would be there when he wanted it. The lamp on the table flickered slightly as the breeze outside found its way through the crack at the kitchen window. That soft tremor in the light reminded him of another night, many years ago, when the same lamp had burned on this table. He had been a boy then, sitting opposite his grandfather, a deck of cards spread between them. They had played well past his bedtime, neither of them keeping score in any serious way. Outside, the wind had been stronger than tonight, rattling the porch swing's chains against the boards. Every so often, his grandfather had looked toward the sound and smiled, as though reassured by it. That memory, like so many others, didn't feel distant so much as folded into the present. It was as if the air of the room had kept it safe all this time, bringing it forward again now without any effort on his part. Eli moved to the sink and poured the last of the tea from the pot, drinking it slowly even though it had cooled. The taste was still there, earthy and calm, and it lingered in the same way the evening's light had lingered before giving way to night. When the cup was empty, he rinsed it and set it upside down on the drying rack, then reached to turn down the lamp. The room deepened into shadow, but it did not feel empty. If anything, the quiet seemed fuller now, as though the house itself was settling for the night. He made his way down the short hallway toward the bedroom, passing the doorway to the small sitting room. The old rocking chair was there, angled slightly toward the window as it had been for as long as he could remember. On the sill sat a small clay jar filled with dried sprigs of lavender, its scent faint but steady even after all these months. He paused at the bedroom door, resting his hand on the frame. Through the window across the room, the sky was dark enough that only the outline of the maple branches was visible, reaching upward like a quiet benediction. He set the quilt at the foot of the bed and sat for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. The bed creaked softly as he lay back, the familiar weight of the blankets drawing over him. The fabric smelled faintly of sun from the last time it had been hung out to dry. He closed his eyes and listened to the distant call of the owl, to the low sigh of the wind in the orchard, to the subtle shifting of the house as it breathed into the night. It struck him as he drifted toward sleep that this was what he had always sought, even without naming it, a place where the boundaries between memory and the present moment could blur, where each night carried the comfort of all the nights before it. Here, the land held the house held him, and he held the quiet, and in that layered stillness, he felt himself being carried gently toward rest, as though the porch swing's motion had followed him inside, rocking him once more into the safety of sleep. The morning came gently in that unhurried way the countryside has of waking. Eli stirred before the sun had fully risen, lying still for a moment as the weight of sleep slowly lifted from him. The first thing he noticed was the quiet, a quiet not of absence but of presence. It was the kind that let you hear the smallest sounds, the faint tick of the clock in the kitchen down the hall, the soft rustle of the curtains where the window was cracked open, the nearly imperceptible hum of the earth itself, as though the land were breathing in its sleep. Light seeped gradually into the room, brushing against the walls in pale strokes. Through the window he could see the first faint glimmer of gold spilling over the ridge. The branches of the maple stirred slightly, the leaves moving as though reluctant to let go of the night's stillness. Their edges were tinged with early hints of color, just the faintest burnish of amber and russet, like the first whisper of a change still far off but inevitable. He lay there a little longer, watching the slow procession of light across the room. It touched the old dresser first, glinting briefly on the brass knobs, before sliding down to the floorboards. The smell of the quilts, warmed by his own body through the night, rose faintly around him. Wool and sun and something older still, a scent that belonged as much to memory as to fabric. From outside, the low coo of a mourning dove drifted in. It was answered, after a pause, by another from somewhere beyond the orchard. Their voices met and mingled as though exchanging the first greetings of the day. Eli listened to them, feeling their rhythm settle into him. Eventually, he swung his legs over the side of the bed, the floor cool against his bare feet. He moved slowly, not from stiffness, but from a desire not to disturb the fragile balance of the morning. The house was still in shadow as he stepped into the hallway, his hand brushing the wall in the same way it always had when he walked this path. In the kitchen, the light had grown brighter, spilling through the small window above the sink. The air there felt fresher, touched by the faint chill that had drifted in overnight. On the table, the bowl of apples caught the morning sun, each one holding a soft sheen as though they'd been polished in their sleep. He reached for the kettle, filling it from the old enamel pitcher, the water splashing in a rhythm that felt as old as the place itself. As the kettle began to heat on the stove, Eli opened the back door. The hinges gave their usual soft complaint, and a breath of morning air flowed in, carrying with it the smell of dew on grass and the faint, earthy sweetness of fallen leaves. Stepping out onto the porch, he paused, letting his eyes adjust to the brightness. The swing was just as he'd left it, the seat slightly angled as though waiting for him. He lowered himself onto it, the quilt now draped over his shoulders. The chains gave a faint groan, and so he began to rock, the motion matching the pace of the day's first moments. From the orchard, the sound of a single apple dropping into the grass reached him. Somewhere beyond that, a rooster called, late by some standards, but right on time for this place. The call was answered not by another rooster, but by the small, everyday sounds of the farm waking. A gate's latch clicking, a shovel leaning back against the shed wall, the distant lowing of cattle carried faintly from a neighbor's field. He thought of how many mornings had begun just like this, how the rhythm of the days here was less about clocks and more about the way light moved across the land. There had been mornings in his youth when he'd risen earlier, hurrying into the work of the day. But now, the work began with this, sitting still, listening, allowing the morning to arrive fully before he set his hands to anything else. The kettle's whistle drifted out to him, a reminder that warmth was waiting inside, but he stayed on the swing a little longer, watching a single spiderweb strung between the porch railing and the post. Dew had gathered along its threads, catching the light in small beads that trembled with each passing breath of wind. He imagined the spider, somewhere nearby, waiting with the same patience the land seemed to carry. At last he rose and went back inside, pouring the steaming water over the tea leaves. The scent rose at once, curling upward in a quiet offering. He carried the cup back to the porch, cradling it in both hands, and returned to the swing. The tea was hot, and he sipped it slowly, feeling it spread its warmth through him. From this spot, he could see the edge of the field where the grass bent in waves under the morning breeze. A small flock of starlings darted low over the ground, their flight quick and sure, each turn taken as though by a single mind. He watched them disappear toward the far fence, leaving the air empty for a moment before another bird's shadow passed overhead. The morning deepened by degrees. Sunlight crept higher on the orchard's trunks, turning the bark's rough lines into maps of gold and shadow. Somewhere hidden from sight, a brook's faint murmur joined the air, the sound carrying only when the wind shifted in just the right way. Eli leaned back, letting the quilt slip lower on his shoulders, and close his eyes for a moment. The warmth of the sun was gentle yet steady, like a hand resting in reassurance. It was in moments like this, he thought, that the boundaries between himself and the land blurred, until he could not say where one ended and the other began. He opened his eyes again to see the first leaf of the season drift down from the maple, small, amber edge, turning slowly as it fell. It landed on the porch step without a sound. He knew there would be many more in the weeks to come, but the first always felt like a quiet promise, a reminder that change could arrive softly, without urgency or alarm. And so he sat, letting the morning pass in its own time, holding both the tea and the stillness as though they were the same thing. The sun had risen a little higher when Eli first heard it, the slow crunch of tires on the gravel lane that curved down toward his house. It was not the sound of a stranger coming too fast, but of someone moving carefully, knowing the road's soft edges and the way it narrowed before the bend. He set his cup down on the small table beside the swing, listening as the sound drew closer, then came to a gentle stop somewhere beyond the front gate. A moment later, the low thump of a car door echoed across the yard, followed by the steady rhythm of footsteps on the packed earth. Through the leaves of the orchard, a figure came into view, walking with that unhurried gait of someone who had traveled not to arrive quickly, but to arrive well. It was May. He recognized her before her face came clear, the tilt of her shoulders, the way her hand brushed the top of the fence post as she passed it. May had lived in the next valley over for as long as Eli could remember. She had been a neighbor in the truest sense, close enough to call on in the middle of the night if need be, far enough to give each other space to live as they pleased. "Morning, Eli," she called softly, as if not to disturb the porch's peace. Her voice was touched with the cool air of the drive over, the words carrying the faint crispness of autumn. "Morning, May," Eli replied, rising from the swing. "You're out early." She smiled as she came up the steps. "Thought I'd see if you still remember how to share a pot of tea." He stepped aside, gesturing toward the empty chair beside him. "It's still warm," he said. "Kettle's only been off the stove a little while." She settled into the chair, setting a small cloth-wrapped bundle on the table between them. When she unfolded it, the smell of fresh biscuits drifted out, still holding the oven's heat. "I figured you hadn't bothered with breakfast yet," she said. "You always did let the day get ahead of you before you thought to eat." Eli poured her a cup of tea, the steam curling upward in the space between them. The clink of the spoon against the cup was the only sound for a moment, save for the quiet shift of the swing's chains. They sat that way for a while, no rush to speak, no need to fill the air. The morning seemed to settle more deeply around them, as though the porch had been waiting for two people to occupy it instead of one. May broke the silence first. "Saw the first bit of frost on my lower pasture this morning," she said. "Didn't last long once the sun got to it, but it was there." Eli nodded, picturing her land, how the frost would have clung to the grass in the hollows, how it would vanish in a shimmer when touched by light. "It's coming earlier this year," he said. "Feels like the seasons are in a hurry." "Maybe," May replied, tearing a biscuit in half and handing him a piece. "Or maybe we're just paying more attention now." They ate, slowly, the biscuits crumbly and warm, the butter melting into each bite. The tea cooled between them, sipped in small mouthfuls. Every so often, May would glance toward the orchard, following the movements of a squirrel leaping from branch to branch, or watching as a pair of bluebirds flitted down to the fence rail. Eli found himself remembering other mornings with her, not many, but enough to hold their own kind of weight. There had been a spring years ago when they had sat on this same porch, waiting for news from town. Another time in high summer, they had shared a bowl of peaches while a storm moved slowly across the far ridge. Those moments had never been about anything grand. They were the kind that lived on simply because they had been kept company by the quiet. May's eyes drifted to the maple tree at the edge of the yard. "Lost a big limb there in that storm last winter," she said, "but it's still standing." "Some things hold on," Eli answered, "even after they've been changed." Her gaze lingered on the tree a moment longer, then she turned back to him. "You've always been good at noticing the parts that stay," she said. "I think that's why this place feels safe." Eli didn't answer right away. He felt the truth of her words settling into him the way sunlight sank into the porch boards. Slow, steady, leaving its mark without fanfare. A breeze came up, carrying the faint scent of apples from the orchard. May closed her eyes for a moment, breathing it in. When she opened them again, she smiled, and it was the kind of smile that needed no reason beyond the simple fact of being here. They finished their tea, letting the last of the morning stillness stretch between them. When May stood to go, Eli walked her to the gate. The gravel crunched again under her steps, and the sound of her car starting was soft, almost hesitant, as though it didn't wish to intrude. When the lane was quiet again, Eli returned to the swing. The quilt was still warm where he had been sitting, and the half-empty teapot waited patiently. He poured himself another cup, settling into the gentle rhythm of the porch once more, carrying the warmth of May's visit into the rest of the day. When the sound of May's car faded into the distance, the stillness that returned was different from the one Eli had woken to. It was deeper now, holding a new kind of quiet that comes after good company leaves. A quiet that was not empty, but full. He sat on the swing a while longer, the cup warm in his hands, letting the last threads of conversation drift through his mind like smoke curling from a chimney on a windless day. The light had shifted. It was no longer the pale gold of early morning, but the more certain glow of mid-morning sun, stretching further across the yard and spilling over the tops of the orchard trees. From where he sat, he could see the way the light made the apples shine, small glints of red and gold among the leaves. They were not yet at their peak, but some had ripened early, their color deep enough to promise sweetness. He finished the last of his tea, set the cup down, and rose. There was no need for a decision. His feet found the path without thought, carrying him down the porch steps and toward the orchard. The grass was still damp from the night, and it brushed against his boots with each step, leaving darkened patches that slowly lightened as he moved on. The air there was different, cooler under the canopy of leaves, yet rich with the mingled scents of earth, bark, and the faint tartness of fallen fruit. A light wind shifted through the branches, setting some of the apples swaying gently as though testing their readiness to fall. He reached one of the older trees first, its trunk thick and ridged with age. This was a tree that had been here long before him and would likely remain long after. It had weathered storms, late frosts, dry summers. Eli laid a hand against its bark, feeling the roughness beneath his palm, the quiet pulse of life that rose through it. On the ground nearby, a small scattering of apples lay in the grass. Some were bruised from the fall, but others still held their shape, their skins taut and smooth. He crouched and picked one up, turning it over in his hand. It was cool to the touch, the faint scent of its flesh rising where a stem had snapped clean. Taking a small bite, he felt the crispness break under his teeth, the juice running bright and tart over his tongue. It was the taste of the season before it was fully born. Sharp at first, but softening as it lingered. He began to pick, not in a hurry, moving slowly from branch to branch. Each apple he chose was considered, turned in the light, weighed in his palm. Some were tucked gently into the small wooden crate he'd carried down with him. Others, with a small imperfection, went into his coat pocket for eating later. With each step, memories seemed to rise from the ground as easily as the fallen leaves. He remembered mornings when his father had walked the same path ahead of him, the sound of the old man's boots steady in the dew. He remembered, too, the way his mother would set a basket of fresh apples on the kitchen table, the scent filling the house so completely that it seemed to rest in the walls themselves. There had been years when the orchard was so heavy with fruit they could hardly keep up, days when neighbors came to help with the picking, laughter threading through the trees like sunlight. Other years had been sparse, the yield just enough for the family's needs. Through it all, the orchard endured, the seasons moving through it like a steady hand turning the pages of a book. After a while, Eli paused beneath a younger tree, one planted not long after he returned to the farm for good. Its branches still reached upward with a kind of eagerness, the bark smooth in places where time had not yet had its say. He thought of the work that had gone into planting it, digging the hole, setting the roots, packing the earth back in with care. The memory carried a satisfaction deeper than pride, the quiet knowledge that some efforts were meant not for one's own gain, but for those who would come after. The crate grew heavier with each passing tree, but Eli didn't mind. He set it down when he needed to, taking a moment to straighten his back, to breathe in the mingled scents of apple and leaf. Above him, a small patch of sky showed through the canopy, a clear, deep blue that seemed to promise fair weather for days to come. A single leaf drifted down, spinning as it fell, and landed atop the apples in the crate. Its color was a rich gold, and for a moment he simply looked at it, struck by how it seemed to rest there as if it had always belonged. By the time he reached the far edge of the orchard, the sun was high enough to warm the crown of his hat. He set the crate down in the grass, looking back at the rows of trees. There was no sense of having completed a task, only the feeling of having participated in something larger than himself, an unbroken exchange between the land and those who cared for it. He stood there a while, letting the breeze pass over him, carrying with it the sound of a woodpecker tapping somewhere beyond the fence line. It was the kind of moment that asked for nothing but presence, the simple act of being here in this place on this day. When he finally lifted the crate again, it was with a slow steadiness. The weight was real, but it was a good weight, the kind that speaks of work done honestly, of time given freely. He began the walk back toward the porch, the sound of the apples shifting gently in their wooden frame marking each step. As the house came into view, he felt the familiar pull of the swing waiting for him, the promise of setting the crate down, of pouring another cup of tea, of letting the day stretch ahead without urgency. There would be other apples to pick in the days to come, but for now, this was enough. And in that enoughness, he found the kind of quiet that lasts. The crate of apples rested on the porch for a while, as though it too needed a moment to breathe after the walk from the orchard. Eli sat beside it, the wood of the swing pressing gently into his back as it swayed, with the slow rhythm of his foot on the floorboards. The air had grown warmer now, and the scents of the orchard seemed to cling to the apples, if fresh, earthy, with that faint hint of sweetness that came when the fruit was still wearing the morning's dew. He thought about letting them be for a time, perhaps until later in the afternoon, but there was a pull inside him, one that came from the memory of another kind of warmth, the warmth of the kitchen in early autumns past when his mother would bring in the first crate of apples and begin the slow work of turning them into something meant to last. It wasn't only about the jars that would line the pantry shelves. It was about the way the whole house would seem to lean into that fragrance, as if it too wanted to be part of the preserving. Eli rose, lifted the crate, and carried it toward the kitchen. The door hinges gave their familiar sigh as he pushed it open, and the cool shade of the house met him like an old friend. He set the apples down on the wide wooden counter, their colors glowing softly in the muted light that came through the single small window above the sink. For a moment, he just stood there, letting the quiet settle. The kitchen had its own kind of stillness, different from the porch or the orchard. Here, the air was heavy with the faint scent of flour and wood smoke, and the shadows seemed to hold the outlines of all the mornings, afternoons, and evenings that had passed within these walls. He found the paring knife in the drawer, its handle worn smooth, the steel blade still sharp despite its years. The apples waited, and he began the work of peeling, the thin ribbons of skin curling away and falling onto the counter in soft, spiraled piles. It was a task that asked for no rush. Each apple was turned in his hand, the knife moving with the easy care of someone who has done this more times than he can remember. Now and then he would pause to cut away a small piece and taste it. Some were sweeter than others, but each held that bright, clean flavor of fruit that had been given the time it needed to ripen. He placed the peeled apples in a wide, heavy pot, their pale flesh catching the light for a moment before settling into the shadow of the enamel. A little water, a measured scoop of sugar, and a sprinkle of cinnamon followed. The cinnamon was the kind that carried a warmth you could almost see, and as he shook it into the pot, the air began to change. It was subtle at first, just a whisper of spice over the quiet, but it would grow. He set the pot on the stove and lit the flame beneath it, the soft tick of ignition giving way to the low, steady hum of heat. As the apples began to soften, the kitchen filled with a scent so deep and familiar it felt almost like music. The sweetness of the fruit, the earthiness of the peel, the warm spice, all of it rose and mingled in the air, wrapping itself around the room. Eli leaned against the counter, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the fragrance settle into him the way it had on mornings long past. He remembered standing in this very kitchen as a boy, barely tall enough to see over the counter, watching his mother stir the pot. She would hum sometimes, the tune shifting with no particular pattern, as though the song was being made new each time. He had not thought of those moments in years, but now they returned with such clarity that he could almost see her hands, steady and sure, guiding the wooden spoon through the bubbling fruit. The apples softened more, the spoon moving easily through them now. He took his time, letting them cook until the pieces gave way at the slightest touch. It was not about the recipe. It was about knowing when the apples had given all they had to give, when the flavors had become something richer than the sum of their parts. He ladled the hot mixture into clean jars, the glass clouding for a moment as it met the heat. One by one, they lined up on the counter, each catching the light in a slightly different way. There was a quiet satisfaction in seeing them there, warm and full, their lids waiting to be sealed. When the work was done, he left one small jar unsealed. This one he knew would not last the week. It would find its way onto slices of fresh bread or perhaps into a warm bowl of oatmeal on the chill mornings that were sure to come. He cleaned the counter, wiped the knife, and left the kitchen window open a little wider. The scent of apples and cinnamon drifted out into the yard, mixed with the crispness of the autumn air. Somewhere, a bird called from the hedgerow, its voice carrying in the stillness. Eli carried the unsealed jar and a spoon back to the porch. The swing was waiting, and when he sat down, the boards beneath him seemed to welcome the familiar weight. He tasted the apples, warm, soft, with just enough spice to linger. The flavor was as much a memory as it was a taste, and as he ate, the day seemed to open up around him, unhurried and full. Beyond the yard, the orchard stood in quiet order, its leaves turning slowly in the sun. The world was still, except for the gentle creak of the swing and the faint hum of a bee drifting somewhere nearby. It was a moment that needed nothing more than what it already held, and so he stayed there, the jar warm in his hand, letting the morning pass into afternoon without notice. By early afternoon, the sun had softened, its light slipping through a thin veil of cloud. The shadows in the yard lengthened, stretching toward the edges of the porch. Eli sat for a while longer with the small jar of apple preserves resting on the swing beside him. It was still warm to the touch, though not so warm that it couldn't be carried down the lane. He knew where it was going before he'd even finished his last spoonful earlier. A quiet decision that had come not from any sense of obligation, but from the small tug of kindness that sometimes rose in him without asking. He went inside, found a square of clean linen, and tied it over the lid with a bit of twine. It made the jar look like something prepared for giving, though the gift itself was simple. On the table near the door, he picked up his old cap, the brim softened from years of weather and wear. With the jar in one hand and the cap in the other, he stepped back outside. The road to May's house was not long, though it bent gently between fields that were now in their last flush of green. He liked to walk there on days like this, when the air was neither warm nor cold, and the quiet seemed to settle deep enough that even the smallest sound, a crow in the distance, the sigh of the wind through dry grass, felt like it had traveled far to reach him. As he walked, he thought of May, not as a neighbor, though she was that, but as someone whose life had brushed against his in ways small but lasting. She had been his mother's friend first, long before he was old enough to remember. He could recall her presence in the kitchen on certain afternoons when he came home from school, the low hum of two women talking, the clink of cups on saucers, the smell of coffee drifting through the house. May had a way of listening that made you feel she could hold whatever you gave her without letting a bit spill away. Her house came into view after the curve in the road, a small white place with green shutters that had faded to the color of moss. The yard was neat, though not in a fussy way, and the lilac bush near the gate held a scatter of golden leaves at its base. He lifted the latch on the wooden gate and walked up the path, the crunch of gravel underfoot breaking the long stretch of quiet. May answered the door after a moment, her hands wiping against her apron as though she had been in the middle of something, though with May that something was often more about tending than doing. Her hair, silver and soft, was pulled back loosely, and her eyes had that same clear gentleness he remembered from boyhood. "Well now, Eli," she said, the smile in her voice matching the one on her face. "This is a surprise." He held out the jar. "I made a batch this morning," he said. "Thought you might like a little." Her hands came forward slowly, as if the jar were more fragile than glass. "Oh my," she said, looking at it as though it were already part of some memory she would keep. "Apple and cinnamon, if I know you right." He nodded. "From the orchard this morning. They were too good not to use right away." She stepped aside and waved him in. The house smelled faintly of baking bread, and the warmth inside was different from the day's warmth outside, deeper, gathered from the slow work of the stove. The furniture was worn but cared for, the wood polished to a quiet glow. Near the window, a kettle sat on a trivet, and beside it, 2 cups waited on a small round table. "I was just about to have tea," May said. "You'll join me?" He agreed without hesitation, setting his cap on the chair beside him. She moved without hurry, filling the cups and placing the jar in the center of the table as though it were part of the meal. They talked of simple things at first, the weather, the state of the road past the mill, the neighbor's new calf, the kind of talk that had no urgency, where each word seemed to have time to settle before the next arrived. After a while, May rose to slice a piece of bread still warm from the oven. She spread a bit of the apple preserve on one slice, the cinnamon scent mingling with the yeasty warmth of the bread. She handed it to him, then took her own. The first bite was as much about the sound, the soft tear of crust, the quiet hum of approval from May, as it was about taste. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the kind of silence that doesn't press or weigh. Outside, a few dry leaves scraped along the walk, and the light through the lace curtains shifted as the clouds thinned. When the bread and tea were finished, Eli didn't rise to leave right away. He stayed, letting the warmth of the moment reach whatever parts of him had felt cool and quiet for too long. May spoke of the apple trees she'd had when she was young, the way her father had taught her to graft branches from one variety to another. Her words carried the orchard into the room, and for a time, it felt as though the past and present had folded neatly together. Eventually, he did stand, thanking her for the tea and for the company. She walked him to the door, the jar of preserves still on the table, catching the afternoon light. As he stepped out onto the path, she called after him, "You'll come again before the frost, won't you?" He turned, smiling. "I will," he said. The walk home was slower, not because of the weight in his hands, there was none now, but because of the way the day seemed to have grown fuller. The fields on either side of the road had taken on a deeper hue in the softening light, and the wind had cooled just enough to make the air feel close to evening. By the time he reached his porch, the swing was waiting, the crate of apples still in its place. He sat, the boards giving that same familiar groan beneath him, and watched the first faint streaks of gold touch the tops of the trees. It was enough in that moment, simply to be where he was. By the time Eli returned home from May's, the afternoon had grown quieter in that particular way. Late September afternoons do. Not simply less noise, but a kind of deeper stillness, as though the air itself had settled into a gentle waiting. He walked slowly up the path toward his porch, the boards of the steps looking a little more golden than they had in the morning, the nails glinting faintly in the angled light. The crate of apples he had left earlier was still there, catching bits of sun between the leaves he hadn't brushed away. He set his cap on the railing and lowered himself onto the swing. The wood sighed beneath him, a sound so familiar it felt like the porch itself was greeting him back. He leaned into the curve of the seat, letting his body rest into the slow sway that began almost without his effort. A gentle rhythm, like the way a leaf might rock before falling. Across the yard, the maples had begun to deepen in color. Not fully red yet, not even the sharp orange that would come later, but a kind of dusty ember tone, as if the season was testing its palate before committing to the full fire. The wind picked at the edges of the leaves, turning some so their paler undersides caught the light, like quick flashes of silver among the branches. In the distance, the low hum of a tractor drifted over the fields. Eli could tell, even without seeing, which neighbor it might be and which plot they were working. The sound of the machine dipping slightly as it crossed a small hollow, the way the engine paused just so before starting again. It was a comfort, these small, steady labors happening just out of sight, like a heartbeat you didn't have to think about to trust. A sparrow landed on the railing near the steps, hopping twice, tilting its head toward him as though to check whether he was a threat or simply part of the landscape. He stayed still, and after a moment it flitted away to the tall grass at the fence line, its wings making that faint, dry rustle he'd always thought sounded like paper being folded. The sun had dipped low enough now that the shadows of the porch posts stretched across the yard in long, soft lines. They reached almost to the old apple tree, its trunk dark against the light that poured over the field beyond. In that light, the grasses glowed from within, as though they had caught and held the gold for themselves. Eli's eyes wandered toward the far edge of the field, where the land rose slightly before dropping into the creek hollow. From here, he couldn't see the water, but he could imagine the slow movement beneath the shade of the sycamores, the way that surface might catch a bit of sky between the leaves. He thought of the times he'd gone down there in late summer, barefoot on the stones, watching the minnows dart between his toes while the smell of damp earth and riverweed rose in the heat. A single cloud, long and thin, drifted across the sun, muting the colors for a few moments. When it passed, the light returned softer, spreading itself over the land like a quilt at day's end. It made him think of evenings years ago when his mother would call him in from the yard, and he would step from the cool grass onto the warm boards of the same porch, the swing creaking as she rose to hold the door for him. Somewhere beyond the orchard, a dog barked twice, sharp and brief, and was answered by another farther away. The sound faded quickly, swallowed by the lengthening quiet. Eli let his gaze rest on the horizon, where the sky was beginning to gather, that faint lavender blush it always seemed to wear before the first stars. It was a color that came and went quickly. You could miss it if you were distracted, but he had learned to wait for it, the same way you might wait for a kettle to boil or for bread to rise. A small, ordinary patience. On the step below him, the jar of preserves he had kept for himself sat unopened, its linen cover catching a slant of sunlight. He imagined opening it later after the day had folded fully into night, spooning a bit over a slice of bread while the stove hummed in the kitchen. It was not a grand thought, but then most of what made life steady and worth living was not grand at all. The swing rocked on, its rhythm in time with the slow beat of his breathing. From this place, this patch of wood and air in familiar view, the world seemed at once vast and small enough to hold, and as the first cool edge of evening touched his skin, Eli felt the quiet settle deeper, like a blanket drawn just close enough to keep out the chill. The evening had been gathering itself quietly, like a careful hand folding the day into smaller, softer shapes. By the time Eli rose from the porch swing, the last light was holding low along the horizon. A gentle amber glow pressed thin over the ridge, and above it the first star trembled faintly in the fading blue. He stood for a moment, resting his hand on the porch post as though to anchor himself in the view. The apple tree was a dark silhouette now, its leaves barely moving, each branch drawn in against the cooling air. Somewhere in the orchard, a cricket began its song, slow and steady, a metronome for the night ahead. Eli stepped inside, the screen door tapping shut behind him with that familiar wooden rattle. The house greeted him with its own kind of evening hush, the scent of apples still clinging from the morning, mixed with the faint sweetness of the preserves cooling on the counter. The air was cooler here, the kind of cool that made you think of quilts and low flames. On the kitchen table sat the lamp with its glass chimney, a thin layer of dust along the brass base. He lifted the chimney, set a match to the wick, and watched as the flame caught and grew, its light gathering the corners of the room into a warm embrace. The shadows leaned back, and in that small golden circle, the wood grain of the table seemed deeper, its knots and lines telling their own quiet stories. He moved with the easy rhythm of someone who had done this countless times before. A kettle of water set on the stove, a mug placed ready beside a small jar of honey. As the water began to whisper and then hum, he wandered to the cupboard, pulling out a tin of dried chamomile that released its soft apple-like fragrance the moment the lid was turned. It mingled with the lamp's faint scent of warm metal, and the kitchen felt, all at once, entirely whole. While the tea steeped, Eli carried his mug into the front room where the big oak desk stood near the window. It wasn't much to look at, a surface worn to a satin dullness, a few scratches that ran like shallow rivers across it. But it was where he kept his journals. On the top shelf above, spines in different shades of brown and green stood shoulder to shoulder, each one marked with the year in a hand that had grown more deliberate over time. He reached for the current one, its leather cover still holding the faint smell of the tannery from years ago. He opened it to a page about halfway through, the previous entries filled with small notations of weather, visits from neighbors, the slow progress of the seasons. Tonight he uncapped his pen and began in the same way he always did, with the date and then a pause, not for lack of words, but to let the day rise in his mind again before setting it down. He wrote of the morning's apple picking, the way the sunlight had caught in May's hair as they stood in her kitchen. He noted the taste of the preserves, how the syrup had caught the light in the jar like a piece of amber. And he described the porch swing, how the creak of its chains in the late afternoon had blended so perfectly with the far-off hum of the neighbor's tractor that he'd nearly drifted into sleep without realizing it. The words came slowly, not because there was too little to say, but because each moment deserved its own space on the page. The scratch of the pen was steady, and outside, the crickets played on, their song filtering through the window screen like a distant lullaby. When the tea had cooled enough, he set down the pen and lifted the mug, letting the steam curl into his face. It was a simple blend, but the chamomile's softness seemed to settle in his chest, loosening something he hadn't known was tight. He carried the mug to the armchair in the corner, where a small quilt lay folded. Pulling it over his knees, he sank back and let his eyes rest half closed. From here, he could see out the window, the dark shapes of the yard, the faint gleam of the porch boards under the starlight. The swing hung still now, a quiet shape among the deeper quiet of the night. Somewhere in that darkness, the apples in the crate were cooling, their skins breathing out the last of the day's warmth. It comforted him, this thought that even in stillness, the world was carrying on its own small labors. He took another sip, feeling the day settle deeper inside him, and thought that perhaps tomorrow he might walk down to the creek again, not for any reason other than to see the water and hear what it had to say. For now, though, the night was enough. The lamp's light pooled softly over his knees, the tea was warm in his hands, and the air held that faint early autumn sweetness that promised both rest and the slow turning of days. The night deepened, not in haste, but as though it had been waiting patiently all along, settling gently over the land like a quilt drawn up over a sleeping child. Eli sat in his armchair, the lamplight still gathered around him in a soft golden pool, and listened to the house breathe. There was the faint ticking of the mantel clock, a sound so constant and familiar that he rarely noticed it anymore, except in moments like this, when the rest of the world had grown so quiet. The tea had cooled to a pleasant warmth. He cradled the mug in both hands, feeling the smooth curve of the ceramic under his fingertips, and let the taste linger on his tongue. It was as if the chamomile had drawn something out of the day, some slow, easy patience, and left it behind in the air around him. Beyond the window, the yard lay in a wash of silver moonlight. The porch boards glimmered faintly, and the swing cast a gentle swaying shadow, though it had not moved for hours. The apple tree was a darker shape now, its leaves whispering only when the breeze drifted close enough to touch them. Somewhere out in the pasture, a single owl called, its voice deep and certain in the stillness. Eli let his gaze travel from the tree to the far fence line, where the shadows gathered thick, and beyond that to the hill that rose like a quiet shoulder under the sky. He had walked those slopes in every season, in the raw chill of March, when the earth was still soft underfoot and smelled of thawing roots, in the bright, restless days of summer, when the grasses brushed high against his legs, and now, in the steady, measured grace of early autumn, when the colors came on slowly, like a thought half remembered. He thought of how many mornings had begun here, on this very porch swing, with the air cool against his skin and the sound of the kettle inside. There was a kind of faith in those mornings, not a loud or certain faith, but one that moved quietly under the surface, anchoring the day before it had even begun. His eyes fell to the quilt across his knees. It was the same one May had made years ago, each patch cut from a shirt or dress that had long since worn through. Some mornings when the light was right, he could trace his fingers along the seams and remember exactly where each piece had lived before. A blue check from a Sunday shirt, a strip of faded calico from a summer dress that smelled faintly of lilac, a piece of corduroy from a work coat that had carried the scent of wood smoke for years. It was as though the quilt itself held the seasons, stitched together in a way that could not be undone. He leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the sounds beyond the walls. The faint rustle of leaves, the creek murmuring somewhere in the dark, the steady rhythm of the cricket's song. There was a harmony to it all, an unspoken agreement between the night and the land. Nothing hurried, nothing forced. When he opened his eyes again, the lamplight felt warmer somehow, as though the flame had drawn a little closer. The clock ticked on, each second a reminder that time was not something to be chased, but something to be received, like a gift you learn to hold with both hands. He thought of tomorrow, not with the weight of tasks waiting to be done, but with a kind of curiosity. Would the morning light catch the porch in that same golden slant? Would the air carry the scent of the orchard again, or would it smell of rain on the wind? The not knowing felt right, as if each day deserved its own quiet unfolding. He finished the last sip of tea, set the mug gently on the table beside him, and reached over to lower the lamp wick. The flame dipped, flickered, and then held steady at a smaller, softer glow. Shadows leaned in from the corners of the room, but they came not as intruders, only as the natural companions of night. In a while he would rise and make his way to bed, pulling the quilt up to his chin, listening to the same crickets carry their song into the darker hours. But for now, he stayed in the chair a little longer, watching the moonlight rest on the porch swing, feeling the deep, quiet pulse of the house around him. Outside, the world kept its slow watch, the apples cooling in their crates, the owl settling deeper into its perch, the leaves whispering secrets to the wind. And in the small circle of lamplight, Eli felt the kind of peace that didn't ask for anything in return. And so, as the porch swing rests in the hush of early autumn night, and the cool air carries the faint scent of apple and wood smoke, we leave this place quietly, knowing it will be here whenever you wish to return. The moonlight lingers over the fields, the crickets keep their steady song, and all the world seems to breathe in time with your own. May your night be long and gentle, your dreams kind and untroubled. If the weight of the day has been heavy, let it slip away now. There is nothing you must hold on to. Rest well, and wake to a morning that greets you softly. Before we part, I'd love to hear from you, quietly, in your own time. Tell me, what story would you like me to share next?